Now you are.
Right. Well, welcome to the Housing Advisory Board meeting for March 2023. I'm Michael Tracy, the chair of Housing Advisory Board. I just got back from a long trip, so I'm probably about as badly prepared for the meeting as I've ever been. We'll make the best of it with the help of our able board members and staff present. So start by calling the minute in order and a roll call. First, I'm going to call on the newest member of HAB, Karen Clearman, just appointed by City Council. And she is present.
I'm here.
The other, there was another Karen appointed to HAB, Karen with an I, Hoskin, and she was not able to make it tonight, but we're really happy to have the two new members of HAB, which got us back up to seven, a full board. Terry Ramos. Sure. Danny Teodoro.
Here. Hi.
Here. Julianne Ramsey.
Here.
Okay, we not only have a quorum, we have a full house. So very welcome to new HAB members. We're delighted to have you aboard. Agenda review, we'll be approving the minutes. Next, we'll have public participation immediately following that. Item number 6 on the agenda is matters from the board. We have three. We have an ADU code update. This is an item for HAB recommendation. Lisa Hood from Planning Development Services is here. First I've met her in person, by the way. Nice to see you. Item B is the zoning for affordable housing discussion continued. We have Carl Geiler, also Planning Development Services, here for the second time in a row. And then we'll be talking about occupancy. Oh, sorry, that item B is an item for feedback. And item C, we'll be talking about occupancy. Carl also available to present and answer questions about that. And item for feedback.
Michael, I think you're looking at an old agenda. We removed that, remember?
Oh, okay, sorry about that. No, item C, but let's cut it off after item B. Item 7, matter from the staff. We still have that.
Yes.
Great. Recent development highlights. We'll be debriefing our meeting and doing a calendar check and talking about the next meeting, and then we'll be seeking to wrap up by 9 p.m. We're going to go over the rules for public participation in a moment. I do want to note that today is a kind of a sad anniversary. It's the second anniversary of the King Soopers shooting. I believe there's a city memorial going on that right now is conflicting with our meeting, but wanted to make note of that and that very somber day. Okay, we all had a chance to review the minutes for the February 22nd, 2023 meeting. Do I have a motion to approve those minutes?
So moved.
We have a second on that as well. All in favor of approving the February meetings?
Aye.
One abstention. Aaron Kleeman, new to the board. Can we go over the public participation rules before we go into that section? Please, Jay.
Yes, give me 1 second. I forgot to sign into Zoom.
Okay. Record show I'm eating pizza as well. Jay signs it.
Thank you, Tiffany. All right, I'm going to share some slides shortly. Oh, can you enable a screen panel sharing?
Going to screen for very commercial.
Right, one of these days we're going to be fully prepared for this hybrid meeting environment.
One day the technology.
There we go. Hey, just some comments on public participation. So a lot of our participants are very familiar with this, but the city has co-created a vision for productive, meaningful, and inclusive civic conversations, and that comes with some rules. But the idea is that this supports physical and emotional safety for not just community members, but also staff, board and commission members, as well as people of all different identities and lived experiences. If you want more information about it, there's the link to a website. And so the following are some rules of a decorum found in the Boulder Revised Code and other guidelines that support that vision. And these will be upheld during the meeting by our chair, Michael. All remarks and testimony shall be limited to matters related to city business, please. No participant shall make threats or use other forms of intimidation against any person. Obscenity, racial epithets, and other speech and behavior that disrupts or otherwise impedes the ability to conduct the meeting are prohibited. And participants are required to sign up to speak using the name they are commonly known by, and individuals must display their whole name before being allowed to speak online. And please keep in mind, currently only audio testimony is permitted online. And that's it.
Thank you, Jay. For going over that, do we have any members of the public present who would like to comment?
We have one.
Would I be seeing them on the screen if we did, Jay?
Wait 1 second. David Adams.
David Adamson? Yep, David Adamson has his hands up. Okay, David. Got 3 minutes. Look forward to hearing what you have to say.
I'd like to thank you all for your service. I'd like to welcome the new members of the board and the staff. It's been my opinion, after about 8 years working with many of you, that what we're up to here is a lot easier than we think. And I want to leave you with 3 main ideas as you consider this issue of, number 1, providing a lot more middle income for sale, appreciation moderated, mostly car share housing throughout the city will improve every neighborhood, will benefit every citizen. So we won't get into the weeds there, but let's change the frame of your work, not to this titanic struggle trying to cut a Gordian knot, but instead, Boulder's wealth is its people, diverse people. We can maintain the mountain backdrop, and we can add people. We can reduce cars. We can preserve property value or increase it. We can be a model to everyone in this world, especially the developed world, especially high appreciation areas, by moving towards what humans have always been good at, creating livable, walkable, beautiful cities. We can do that. So number 1 can benefit everyone. And I've sent you an email with our ideas about it with the Back Porch Group, bringing together a trans IMBY. It was a trans IMBY group for 2 years. And so I encourage you to look at their approach to this. Let's not reinvent the wheel. So number 1, it can benefit everyone. Number 2, we're so controlled by this idea that people are against more people. But what I think, and I think you might agree, what they're really against is more cars and more auto-related development. And we need to be against that anyway. Walkable, bikeable. We don't need a train for people to have great neighborhoods. And finally, this is a program, the idea of regulating the market to provide what we want for all housing. We're not against luxury housing, but let's have a limit on the amount of luxury housing. How about 10 or 15% max luxury housing for everything that we develop from now on? So that's the idea, to just develop the housing that we need. We can make it work for the market. Thank you very much.
Thank you, David, and thank you for
Thank you, David.
getting it over in 3 minutes on the nose. We will read your memo that you emailed to us and consider your thoughts. Much appreciated.
Thank you.
I would like to divert from the agenda a little bit because I completely forgotten that we have a board member who's been appointed to a group that's looking at the future of the airport. I would love to hear a debrief on that meeting. Is this an appropriate time to do that?
Yeah, everybody agrees. Oh, wait, do we have someone else just that wants to speak? Yeah, just make sure there's no one else there.
Other members of the public that need to speak.
Give me a chance to chew my food.
Sure.
There, no other hands were raised.
So you can close that portion of the agenda.
I'd rather come back to it.
No.
Okay. Take it away.
I think Jay was saying you need to close the
Public hearing.
the public hearing.
Okay, yes, that closes the public comment section. And then we have the caller audible and getting a report from board member Phil Overend on the group that is meeting on the future of the Boulder Airport.
Thank you. So there is a community working group that's been assembled for the purpose of communicating interest from the community about how people see the future of the airport unfolding. So this is in advance of a master plan that's going to be reviewed and revised later this year. And so there's 5 meetings, 4 more meetings coming up. There's one took place last Tuesday. And there's 4 more meetings coming up along with some open house events to have conversations about possibilities for the airport. So the first meeting took place on Tuesday of last week. That was followed by an airport tour, which about a dozen people from the community came. Both events were super interesting. I feel like I've learned a lot, and a couple highlights are sort of scanning the room. I don't know how much detail you want me to go into, but
I don't think we have a packed agenda tonight. So
okay. Well, you just let me
know
let me know if let me know if it sounds like I'm rambling, but the meeting had some different breakout sessions. There was an introduction followed by a charter of participation that kind of outlined some basic principles for how to participate in a community working group. That was followed by some breakout sessions. One of them was oriented towards data, and one of kind of the main themes of the data session. And I'm just working from memory. The thing that stands out the most is there was a graph that showed the number of airplanes parked at the airport has decreased pretty continuously for the last 20 years. One of the questions that came up is how is that possible if the hangar space is all being used? And the answer to that is it probably reflects the fact that fewer and fewer people want to park their airplanes outdoors on the tarmac, strapped down with straps, because they get tired of having their airplanes blown over. That was kind of the I don't know if there was actual data on that or not, but that was sort of the answer I got. There was also a session on a survey that was done with some community members that was kind of an initial foray into getting feedback and trying to find out what the community is concerned about. There are a lot of kind of obvious things like noise complaints, and they still use leaded fuel at the airport, and so there's concerns about lead, environmental issues. There was another session that talked about what are kind of people's hopes and dreams for the airport, and from that I kind of gathered there's there's kind of three camps as far as I can tell, like generally speaking, I don't want to oversimplify, but there's people who are involved with the airport that maybe they own airplanes, their center of life orbits around the airport, and they're excited about having an airport and they'd like to see it continue. There's neighbors who don't like the noise of the airport, and one thing that is causing a lot of noise is touch and goes from training flights that come out of Jeffco. So there's concern around noise about the airport and how to mitigate that. And then there's a small contingent of folks who are interested in housing at the airport, because of course, various people on city council have talked about decommissioning the airport to replace it with housing. It did come up, and they read the section 6.23 of the Boulder Valley comprehensive plan. Mark's colleague Laura Kaplan was there and asking questions about housing. And but I wouldn't say so. There was someone from planning board. Another member from TAB is also participating as a liaison. His name is Ryan Schuhard. And then there were a few community members that spoke up about housing. So I would say those are kind of the three camps. The tour was really fascinating. As someone who sees housing everywhere I look, I was just giddy when I saw the property at the airport. It is a beautiful parcel, and the notion that it could someday be a wonderful housing neighborhood is exciting to me. It's a cool property.
Thank you, Philip. Got a couple of very quick questions, and we can keep going.
Sure.
What is the time frame for this working group? And do you feel there's right to continue the discussion about housing future at the airport?
So I believe it goes through September, October, something like that, the fifth meeting. And then what was the second question?
Do you feel there is an appetite to continue the housing discussion as a long-term vision?
I'd like to interject at some point. I'm anxiously, but whenever you're ready in regard to that particular issue.
Yeah. I mean, I know that I'm interested in injecting that as much as I can. And, I think, I do want to represent HAB. I don't mean to go outside the bounds of what we as a group think about this issue. And I guess I haven't even collected information about it. I just know, like, in general, we're very concerned about missing middle housing. And so, if there's an opportunity there for missing middle, I think that's, the conversation we ought to be having. So, but yeah, I'd love to hear.
Sure.
Mark's.
I'll just say quickly, we haven't told our report or anything, but 130 acres of potential housing future is of strong interest to me.
Yeah.
Personally, I'll be continuing the discussion at that, but sorry, I didn't introduce you earlier, Martin McIntyre. I think you're officially our new.
No, I am the current alternate liaison to have
Okay.
from planning
So
board.
you're the-
And John, who was the primary, is gone. We had his last meeting last night. So anyway, I'm here as the alternate, just to lend some continuity. At our next meeting, we will select the various liaisons from.
You are the potential, but not the de facto.
I'm not the de facto, I am the potential, yes.
But please comment.
Yeah, so last night at 11:30, it was late, but we delved right into this particular issue due to Laura's concerns, which became the planning board's concerns that, and I'm gonna put, I can't help but put my little bit of personal spin on here, that the question being asked is an incomplete question or not the right question? Because the way the mission of the working group is to answer the question of what is the possible future scenario for the airport. Those possible future scenarios include keep it as it is, grow it, make it more of a regional air center, improve it, or the fourth question was decommission it. Not decommission it with a future for housing. The way, and this is the report back from Laura, that the way staff and the consultant, primarily the consultant, but the consultant is exercising a mission that they've been given, was to not to determine whether housing would be a possible future use, but just whether the airport would be decommissioned. So if you ask people, and the point being, if you say, hey, do you want to go through the process and all the heartache of decommissioning an airport without any possible future scenario, could be housing, could be a playground, could be a water park, with no other possible future scenario, then the likelihood of someone saying, yeah, I'm all for decommissioning the airport is very slim. So it's a different question to ask, do you want to decommission the airport, or do you see a vision of greater community benefit in housing or something else? So the action item from planning board last night was planning board is drafting a letter. We have 2 members drafting the letter that we'll edit at our next meeting and submit that to the city manager and the council, because our concern is that the council did not understand that the consultant and the structure was to not discuss housing.
Yep.
And so we are addressing that as planning board, and having planning board have a representative to the working group. So that is anyway, that is my input from our meeting last night.
And who is the planning board representative?
Laura Kaplan.
Oh, great. Yes.
But and it's interesting because planning board has varied perspectives on many issues. But it was we were very cohesive, not in advocating. Laura's not advocating for housing. She is advocating for having a fair playing field and asking the broad question. And I am an advocate of having been involved in many community processes, that if you don't ask, if it's been predetermined by the narrow scope of question, then the outcome gets questioned by the community as well. This was all just, it was all airport people doing it, or it was all housing people doing it. So for me, the key point is you have to ask the right question so that the product of the working group is respected by the community.
And so Mike, so basically the whole notion is, the premise is take on the issue of decommission of the airport in a vacuum in and of itself without tying it to housing, so that it's not tainting the more complicated question of the process of decommission. It's looking at just the notion of whether or not we should have an airport, then, whatever that may lead to, housing or whatever, that's somewhere down the line, but to take the decommission issue in isolation. Is that
right? Yeah, that's correct. And so that's a strange, to the planning board, that's a strange way of doing things. It's like going to a site review and saying, well, your choice is to tear down all the current buildings. We're not really going to talk about a future condition. We're just going to, do you want to tear this stuff down and, or not? And it's like, well,
Right.
we would like to talk about a possible future condition rather than just whether we support tearing something down or not tearing something.
that's interesting. It's definitely challenging.
Can I follow up, Mark's comments? Thank you for summarizing that, bringing that to the attention of this assembly here. I got caught off guard just a little bit in my trying to remember what I wanted to say. So that this is a really important point. I had a subsequent conversation with Laura as well, and we talked about the fact that have a community conversation where you put a lot of effort into the community. You hire consultants and you have a whole process where you leave out this one thing that was like put in the Boulder comprehensive plan, and you sort of say, oh, we're not going to talk about that. Well, then at what point do you talk about that? And then what was the purpose of all this other effort? So I think it would make sense for us to follow planning board to meet and also draft a letter and, to say basically, we believe that this conversation ought to include housing. So I think one of the things they were pushing back on specifically is that this is not like a planning effort. We're not going to sketch out what the neighborhoods are going to look like. But that's different than saying like, here's a vision for what this place could be, and to, pretend like there's no concept of what could be there to motivate people in their decision making, like maybe it's a Six Flags or, anyways, I think it would make sense for us to follow up on this in a similar way.
Great. And is this group going to meet monthly?
The next meeting is the second week of April. I don't think they've actually sent the detailed time and date.
Okay.
Location.
If you could let me know, I'll make sure we get it into the agenda and you can prepare, but your presentation was excellent. Thank you. And I agree with what I'm hearing, if I can digest it, which is our job is to get the housing discussion on the table, not to decide, the future of an airport, not enough on airports and the need for safety maneuvers and all those things, but it's a conversation worth having. And it really pertains directly to our missing middle mission, because we're also going to find 138 acres of city-owned land. Again, not to make that a foregone conclusion, but just a good point of discussion.
And I'll just conclude. I think 6.23 of the BBCP, the last sentence, I just want to read it for the record. At the time of the next airport master plan, the city will work with the community to reassess the potential for developing a portion of the airport for housing and neighborhood serving uses. So as longer I'm on planning board, the more it's like the Bible, right? And so you can interpret it different ways, but it's pretty clear that you will reassess. You will reassess. And that's, no one's asking, I don't think anyone is asking for anything other than housing to be part of the assessment process of the working group. That's really clear.
Okay, well, I'm hearing a lot of consensus around that approach, and maybe we can talk about a resolution at the next meeting, just saying, hey, keep housing on the table. Any other comment on that? Or can we move back into the regular?
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for that, Jake. Matters from the board, we're up to the ADU code update, and we're going to start. This is an item for potential recommendation. We'll start with a staff presentation from Lisa, updating us on what's happening with potential regulatory changes.
All right. Thank you, Chair. Good evening, Housing Advisory Board. It's nice to see you all in person. We were last here in January. I think I was virtual. So giving you an introduction to these upcoming updates. Now we have an actual ordinance. So within that 250-page packet that you guys got, there was actual ordinance language on the accessory dwelling unit update. So my presentation is just going to be a summary of kind of the main topics and changes in that ordinance. And then we have time for public comment specific to this as well. And then I can answer any questions or things like that. So it's kind of the plan. The purpose tonight is for you all to make a recommendation to the city council on this specific ordinance. So it'll be going to city council in late April, early May, and planning board in a couple of weeks. So you guys are the first ones to see it. Just starting off with the absolute basics. I know that you all are very familiar, but for anyone else who's listening, and just to be clear about accessory dwelling unit, how we use it in Boulder. Accessory dwelling unit is a small residence that's sharing a lot with a larger main house. In Boulder, we have both the attached version and the detached version of ADUs. So an attached ADU can be either like an attic apartment or a basement apartment, often can also be an addition. And then the detached is always in a separate structure. So you can see those in the graphics, but it is an independent and self-contained living space. So it's somewhere that has bathroom and kitchen facilities. The scope of this project is to update the regulations related to ADUs. City Council set this as a work program priority for 2022 and 2023. They've narrowed the scope or specified the scope to these 4 items on the screen. And the big objective for this project is to increase the allowance of ADUs in Boulder. So through this project, we're looking at eliminating the ADU saturation limit, modifying the size limits, and then doing some overall clarification and simplification of the regulations, and also improving the approval processes. So I know we walked through this back in January, but just to go through it again, this is the engagement that's been done for this project so far. So we are relying a lot on significant public engagement that was done the last time the ADU regulations were updated, because there's a lot of overlap with the same topics and there was a lot of work done. At that time, it was a more comprehensive overhaul of the regulations. So there's a lot of great stuff to use from there, great input. In addition, we've also met with our community connectors and residents, the planning board, you all back in January, City Council, Board of Zoning Adjustment. We have some virtual engagement opportunities on Be Heard Boulder, which is our engagement site. We've got about 30 comments that have been added into there. Carl and I are having office hours for any members of the public that want to ask questions or get more details about the ordinance in later this month and in April. And then we'll go through the typical public hearing process for ordinance review, starting now until through planning board and city council. So this is a consult level of public engagement, and that's kind of been the plan throughout this project. You all remember that we've talked about the evaluation that was done. So last year we focused on evaluating the changes that happened. They went into effect in 2019 and what impact that those changes had on the ADUs that were constructed in Boulder between 2018 and 2022. I know we have a new member, so I'm glad that this is new information to you because they've seen this chart before. But I just wanted to show ADUs have been allowed in Boulder since the early 1980s. And this chart shows how many were approved each year. So you can see it was very minimal until the last decade or so. And then the yellow lines indicate kind of major code regulation updates. So you can see that there was a significant increase after we made those last updates. And that's what we were really studying, was the period between 2019 and 2022 and how those changes impacted what was approved. I won't go through the whole evaluation again because you guys have seen that, but the evaluation focused on looking at what changes actually reduced barriers to ADUs in Boulder and what potential improvements could we make to further reduce barriers. And that really informed the scope of this project. Last year, we also worked with our housing staff to do a survey of all of the owners of ADUs in Boulder. And we've actually done comparable surveys 5 and 10 years ago. So we were able to compare those numbers to that. About half of owners responded to us, which is a great response rate. And some of the interesting takeaways, there's a lot more detail in your packet in the evaluation, is that compared to 2017, there's a greater percentage of ADUs being used as space for visitors or relatives. Obviously, it's been a unique couple of years situation over COVID. So we're not sure how much that impacted the use of ADUs, but just an interesting note that we saw from that survey. Also, with the most recent survey, we were able to assess the impact of affordable ADUs. So with those changes that happened in 2019, there's a new route for people to get some incentives for larger ADUs or to not have a parking requirement if they choose to do an affordable ADU. And so the way that works is there's a set limit on the rent that can be charged for that ADU. So they're essentially swearing to keep that rent under that rate in exchange essentially for slightly different requirements. So from the survey, we found that 40% of the owners that chose to do the affordable ADU did so for the incentive to reduce the parking requirement. So that's interesting. We also did comparable city research. I know I went through this last time, but we looked at 34 different cities on a bunch of different topics related to ADU regulations, specific to saturation limits. None of the 34 cities that we looked at have a saturation limit. It's just Boulder that has that. Only a few have minimum lot size. Most have only one ADU per lot. Compared to most cities, Boulder's maximum size of detached ADUs is smaller. Although when you look at Colorado tends to be on the smaller side compared to the nation, but still 800 square feet is a typical maximum size. Variation on parking requirements for cities. Some require none, some require 1 or 2, some have different waivers depending on the location. Almost all say that ADUs can't be sold separately, and related to owner occupancy, it's about half and half. So that helped inform this project as well, just looking at what other cities have been doing. And it's certainly a topic that a lot of cities have been addressing recently, as ADUs are seen as an opportunity to increase housing. So the focus for these updates before you tonight, like I said, are these 4 points: saturation limit, size limit, clarification, and approval processes. So I'm going to walk through each one of those and how they are addressed in the draft ordinance. We went through this in January, but the saturation limit only applies in the RL1 and RL2 zoning districts, which are low density residential districts. But essentially, you would take a property, draw a line 300 feet or a radius 300 feet around that property, and only 20% of those properties are allowed to have an ADU. That's a rule that's been in place since 1983, when the ADU regulations were first adopted. In its simplest form, you can see if there were 10 properties, only 2 of them can have ADUs. So it really limits, if you're that third property owner, you have no option or way to get an accessory dwelling unit due to the saturation limit. We do have a waiting list that we have 12 properties on the waiting list, hoping that one of their neighbors gets rid of an ADU and then they would be able to. We increased the saturation limit from 10% to 20% back in 2019. So as part of that evaluation, we looked at what impact that had. And it was pretty interesting because the majority of the ADUs that were approved, we had 200 approved in that time. The majority either are in a district that doesn't have a saturation limit because the saturation limit doesn't apply in all zoning districts, or they would have met that 10% anyway. But there were 41 ADUs that were able to be approved because of that change, that increase from 10% to 20%. I know you've seen this slide before, but the saturation limit really proves to be both a real and perceived barrier to ADUs. That's what the evaluation concluded. It's very confusing for the public. They're not able to measure or understand if their saturation limit has been increased. These are all direct quotes from our Inquire Boulder system, which is our customer service portal that comes through. People asking about the saturation limit. We get hundreds of questions about ADUs, and the majority are about the saturation limit. It's a unique zoning standard because most zoning standards don't change over time. So if your neighbor applies for an ADU, maybe if you want to apply for an ADU, but your neighbor just got theirs approved, now you're not allowed to have an ADU. So there's not a lot of other similar rules that we have like that. So we saw through the evaluation that the saturation limit continued to be a significant barrier to ADUs in Boulder. We also have really evolved our land use code since the saturation limit was first put in place. So I think the original intent of the saturation limit was to try to mitigate any potential impacts of ADUs. They were something that had not been legal for at least half a century before then. They were definitely historically before single family zoning would have been allowed. But for a long time in the 80s, you hadn't seen ADUs for a long time. And so it was kind of a new thing and people weren't sure what the impacts were going to be. But we're now 40 years past when ADUs were first allowed in Boulder. And so we much better understand the impacts of ADUs, and we have a really robust land use code that already reviews for a number of different things. So this chart just shows all of the different regulations that impact ADU design and location. So that can be height and setbacks. We have side yard bulk planes. We have the cumulative length of walls. All of these compatible development standards that we have adopted into the land use code since before the ADUs were adopted. So, and then we also have ADU specific requirements that help to mitigate impacts. We have parking requirements. We have a maximum size. Unlike most residential properties in the city, owner occupancy is required, so the property owner has to live on site. And then the occupancy limit is essentially the same. There's a little bit of flexibility for dependents, so it's not necessarily that there's even increased occupancy on the site. So we think that with all the cumulative, all of these different standards that we have, we're able to adequately mitigate the potential impacts of ADUs without having the saturation limit anymore. So the proposed code change is related to saturation limits, is to eliminate that 20% limit. So we would no longer have a saturation limit in the city of Boulder for any ADUs. It doesn't change the districts where ADUs are allowed, but there just wouldn't be that saturation limit for those low density districts anymore. And if you have questions, feel free to interrupt me.
So all 10 of those houses could have an ADU now.
Exactly. They'd have to meet all of the other standards, but yes, there wouldn't be that limit, that 20% limit anymore.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for that. All right. We can move on to the size limits. This is the other main one. So we have a maximum size of ADUs going back to this graphic. So and they differ based on attached or detached. So for an attached, those top two pictures, it has to be a third of the size of the main house or 1,000 square feet, whichever is smaller. So that whichever is smaller does make a difference, because if you have a 1,500 square foot house, you can't max out, you can't have a 1,000 square foot ADU. It has to be a third of that. So you can only have a 500 square foot ADU because you meet that 1/3. And then the detached, the limit is 550 square feet right now. And this is for a market rate. There is a little bit more flexibility for an affordable unit. It's something that can be varied by our Board of Zoning adjustment. And we had 4 variances get approved in that evaluation time, so 2019 to 2022. They were all very similar situations, an existing basement, and they were all approved between 1,000 and 1,500 square feet. We did go out and look at some of these ADUs that have been approved since 2019. So you can just kind of see the sizes of those and how they look and kind of the different contexts. So these are some examples of detached ADUs that are located on an alley. We wanted to look at, especially because the proposal is to increase the size limits, we wanted to look at some of the larger ones that have been approved as affordable ADUs. So just to give a concept of what that looks like. So you can see these kind of range from upper 600s to 800 square feet. And those are all on alley sides. The picture also shows what it looks like from the street for the main house. There's also some more detached on the alley, some different styles, some adaptations of existing structures into ADUs. This also goes from like 500 to 800, so a wide variety of sizes and styles. We also have detached ADUs that are not on alleys. So you can see these range from 480, which is the bottom right, to over 800 square feet in the top left. So just a different view. There's some, like the bottom middle one, you can't even see it behind the lot. So yeah, spot the ADU. And then we have the attached ADU. You probably wouldn't know if you were driving past or walking past that there are 2 units in any of these houses. And the ones that have asterisks, the ones on the left side, those are the ones that receive variances, so they exceeded the size. But you can see a variety of different styles of the attached ADUs as well. So that's just to give you an idea, some pictures instead of just text. But the proposal for the size changes, we talked last time about the floor area measurement. I think we've talked about that both times I was here. So the proposed ordinance has eliminated the unique floor area measurement that exists for ADUs right now, and instead just uses the floor area measurement that we're using for every other building in the city, which should hopefully simplify things. And then the proposal is to increase the size limits for all of the types of ADUs. So an attached unit would go from 1/3 of the unit or 1,000 square feet to 1/2 of the unit, or the principal unit, or 1,000 square feet. Detached would go from 550 square feet to 800 square feet. And then accordingly, we wanted to increase the affordable allowance to preserve that as an incentive so that people would still be incentivized to do an affordable unit. So the affordable attached would go from a half of the principal unit to, or 1,000 to 2/3 or 1,200. And then affordable detached would go from 800 to 1,000.
Can I ask you a question? How do you define affordable? Is it AMI?
Yeah, so we said that we do a affordable rent chart every year and it's 75% AMI.
Thank you.
And then we also have incentives for historic properties, so designated properties, and so those would be the same as the affordable. Yeah.
So currently measuring square footage, if it's a basement that doesn't have walls exposed and all that kind of stuff, that doesn't count. Right? In a regular house, if you just go build a regular house. Is that the same for ADUs?
So the actual ADU floor area would still, like this 800 would still, we would still count what's in the basement. I know we talked about that
Yeah.
last time.
Yep.
It's something that we wanted to keep it, I mean, that's how the floor area is measured for the bulk essentially. So it's kind of different because it's measuring for the area. So we wanted to keep it as simple as possible and just use the definition that we're using for everything else.
Yeah, but the definition for everything else, basement isn't included.
Excludes it,
It excludes it.
right? But that's the overall structure for the bulk. So
Okay.
yeah, this was we thought that this would be the simplest
You
way.
can't have an 800 square foot detached ADU with an 800 square foot basement. No.
You couldn't use that 800 square foot basement for the ADU. It could be like storage or something.
Got it.
Yeah. Any other questions on this one? Okay. All right, and then there were a number of code clarification items that came up through the evaluation and through discussions that are also included in the ordinance. I know we went through these last time as well, but just to explain how the ordinance drafts it. So there was an issue with the approval of ADUs having an expiration period of only 1 year. And the proposal in the ordinance is to change the accessory dwelling unit from a C to an A. That's a conditional use to an allowed use in the use table. And by doing that, it's no longer an administrative review or a conditional use that has that 1 year expiration. So this is how we would be implementing. We talked about going from a 2-step review of ADUs to a 1-step review. So this turns it into just a 1-step review. People submit a building permit for their ADU. And then that building permit is how we review and approve the ADU instead of it being a separate ADU conditional use application. And then people have to come back for the building permit, which through the evaluation, it just wasn't working well for anybody basically involved to do the 2-step review. So in doing that, there's not this different 1 year expiration period. An ADU is going to be subject to the typical building permit expiration periods that any building permit has to abide by. The next one is flexibility for height of existing structures. So this was one I think we talked about that there's a max height of 25 feet. There is some flexibility for height, but there's a max of 25 feet. And we've had a number of recent examples where it's either a historic building that happens to be over 25 feet, or because of how we measure grade, it's over 25 feet. And they're not able to adapt that into an ADU because there's no flexibility in that height, in that height measurement. So the way that we've amended that in the ordinance is that if it's an existing structure that they're converting to an ADU, as long as they're not increasing the height or increasing the size or changing the roof pitch, they can turn it into an ADU. So that gives some flexibility for those existing structures to be able to convert because there's less impact on the environment and neighbors if it's an existing structure. And then we had some complex standards in there related to roof pitch that are also a relic of the 1980s that we've removed as well.
So if I'm doing a detached ADU and the hard 25-foot height limit is from our usual lowest point of the property out 25 feet to the lowest point 25 feet away, and that measures my height limit.
The typical measurement of height. Yeah. Yeah. So if you're on a steep hill, it can be difficult to meet that. And that's only only existing structures can go up to 25. The typical height limit's only 20 for detached. So if you're building brand new, you'd be stuck at 20.
When you say building the ADU brand new or building, if I have an existing home, then my height limit for my detached ADU, you're proposing 25 feet, but as hard hard stop, or is it 20 feet?
So 20 feet is the requirement for detached ADUs and also garages. Any accessory structure is 20 feet. Right now, the code gives some flexibility up to 25 feet, but no flexibility above 25 feet. So that's where we've gotten some that are like 26 or 27, but they can't be converted into an ADU because that flexibility only comes up to 25. And so, and that's what we are getting rid of, that 25 cap. It's just if you're using an existing structure, then there's no hard cap above that 20, but the 20 remains the main limit.
Even if the existing home, I'm gonna build a new ADU, and the existing home has a 30-foot height to it. And but because of the ADU location and the fact that it's new, I'm still limited to 20 to start and potentially 25, but it's 25, even if my home is actually higher.
Yeah, exactly. So essentially the form of the ADU should be pretty similar to what you could build as a detached garage. The intent.
But the 25 feet goes away if it's an existing garage.
Exactly.
You have an existing alley garage with a loft above it or whatever, and it's 27 feet. You can still turn that into an ADU because it's already there.
Exactly. That's
What this is.
yeah, we're trying to give that flexibility to those because we've had a couple, like some are properties that got annexed into the city, so that structure was higher, or like I said, that slope thing.
And you may not, are you seeing a bunch of flat roof ADUs?
Oh, yeah, that's an interesting one. There weren't, I mean, we went out to 25 or 26. I only saw one that was flat roof.
Oh, really? Okay.
So we haven't been, even with that 25-foot max, so. Yeah,
Okay.
but it's certainly, I mean, there's no requirement for a roof pitch. Or for like compatibility with the main structure, so we could see more flat roofs.
To that point, I would imagine new detached ADUs are gonna be one level, right? Because they're 500-600 square feet. Probably not gonna have a 2-story new detached ADU.
Yeah, I don't think many of them, there's access, like on the garages, they're usually above the garage. So, but the garage doesn't usually have much floor area devoted to the ADU other than getting up there.
Yeah.
So using that flat roof example, I'm intrigued because it could be an interesting prototype for future ADUs. But if you had a loft like space like that and wanted to actually do a loft for like the sleeping area, would that be included in the square footage calculation?
Yeah, if it's habitable space, we would include it.
It's just like a little
A
balcony
mezzanine.
hanging in the main space.
Yeah, there's certain like height limit, or there's height requirements for what we would call habitable space, and then that would count as floor area. So,
Okay.
yeah.
Tough.
Could it be a rooftop deck? Like if it was flat, like could you?
Rooftop deck. How does that work with the height limit?
Problem.
Not sure.
I mean,
Like-
the railings and everything would still fall into the calculation for height. So if you could fit under that 20 feet,
Okay,
good.
okay. Thank you. Yes.
So it's
Could have a very low. fence.
all right. So that's one area we were trying to give some extra flexibility. Lockable separation, this is also just a clarification. It's something that's deep in the code right now, is that the definition of a separate dwelling unit, it has to be separated with a lock. And we run into it a lot with even the applications and then enforcement of separate units. So it's just bringing it into the regulation so people are aware that that is kind of what defines an ADU, is that it's separated. Limited accessory unit is a type of ADU. So I mentioned there's attached and detached. We actually have a third type, the limited accessory unit. We only have one of them in the whole city. And so it hasn't been well utilized and just adds a bunch of text to our ADU standards. And there's other routes that either as non-conforming duplexes or with more liberalized ADU regulations, they could just be an ADU. So we're proposing to remove the limited accessory unit from the code. Owner occupancy, I know we talked about this in January, but we've added some clarity to the definition of owner occupancy about what you do, how you prove owner occupancy if the property is owned by an LLC or LLP. And it's very similar to how someone proves if it's in a trust. So just proving 50% ownership of or membership of the LLC. And then we've added some additional language into the ADU standards about what kind of documentation we need for people to prove that owner occupancy. So that's usually membership agreements or operating agreements or things like that for LLCs. So that's to help with enforcement if there's potential issues. And just to clarify an existing practice with LLCs.
So clarification of, as I recall, owner occupancy requirement is pretty absolute. But there is an ability to like take a sabbatical and sublease for 6 months or.
Yep.
And do you have to apply for a special exemption to do that?
Yeah, thanks for bringing that up. That's actually another thing that we tried to clarify in the code. So you can do that. You can go on sabbatical for less than a year, live outside of Boulder County, but you have to get a temporary rental license exemption. So you don't have to get a rental license as long as you're not gone for more than a year, but you can still rent out your house while you're gone.
You could continue to rent your ADU.
Yep.
and main house.
Yes, exactly. So that housing will be used while people are gone. Yeah.
Owner occupancy question, if, as Michael has many times said, he has an ADU, right?
Yeah.
So you live there, you have an ADU, you're renting it out to person A. What if you decide to move out of that house and rent your main house? And you're no longer owner occupied, then what happens to the ADU ability to rent it?
So you cannot, you have to be owner occupied to be able to rent that ADU. So that would
You
be,
have to rent the whole place to one group.
well, you have to be owner occupied. So if he would have to be living on the property to be able to rent out either the ADU or the main house.
Right. And the hammer is if you move out of your main house, you lose your rental license?
Yeah, that's my question.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, they do have to.
Hey, Denny.
Sorry.
Forgot it.
Voice from above.
Sorry, Dana, did I interrupt you?
I was gonna say, I had that same question, how that plays out.
How does it work when Michael moves out of his house to another house and rents the main house?
Yeah, so when you have a long-term rental license for the ADU, you have to show that you are owner occupied. So our rental licensing team will check that you are still owner occupied. And then you've also sworn through the ADU approval that you will owner occupy throughout. And so there are some cases, a few cases of enforcement where people maybe think or might not be owner occupying. So we have also enforcement officers that deal with that, but it's relatively infrequent.
So you lose, if you have an ADU and it's your house and you decide to move out and rent your house, you can no longer rent the ADU separately.
Right.
It's all one rent, the main house and the ADU is rented to one person.
Yeah, you'd actually have to take the kitchen and the bathroom out of the ADU too.
Oh, really?
Yeah, it's pretty strict.
Oh,
You cannot have the ADU if you're not owner occupying, like it can't exist.
Can't exist.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's counterintuitive.
Yeah, because I would think, especially for like a detached. You have it for 5 years and then life plans change. So I guess your options are to sell or to take down the detached ADU.
Yep.
Wow.
Or just de-ADUize it.
Yeah.
Oh, I see. You could turn it into like storage.
Yeah,
slash
studio.
bedroom Studio, yeah. Okay.
Or even just downstairs, like a wet bar. Yeah, owner occupancy gets complicated.
Right.
And then finally, the public notice requirement, this is similar to the first one. So the change from a conditional use to an allowed use means that there would no longer be a public notice when there's an ADU application, because there's not a separate ADU application anymore. It's just a building permit. So you don't get a notice when your neighbor puts up a garage. You wouldn't get a notice that someone's putting up an ADU. So this is one of the items that facilitates it being a one-step review instead of a two-step review. So there would no longer be a public notice related to ADUs. And we actually looked more into those 34 other cities just to see what their approval processes were like. And it was actually the vast majority do it as a one-step review, as a building permit. It doesn't have a public notice. So that's definitely more common in other cities. We're kind of in the minority there for those comparable cities, at least. So those are kind of the highlights of the ordinance. There's a lot of just code language that's struck and made more simple or made simplified and consolidated and things like that. But those are the highlights. And we'd also be, if the ordinance gets adopted, we'd be making a bunch of process improvements as well, facilitating that one-step review. So it would involve a lot of changes to our application, our electronic application submittal and things like that. And We'd be doing updates to our handouts and videos, and hopefully the simpler that our regulations are, the simpler it will be for people to understand what the rules are. And then we have some other process improvements related to addressing and the declarations of use, which are a legal document that people have to record, that we'd be improving as well. So there's kind of two steps because there's the ordinance and then the process changes, but that's really the summary. The next steps is to continue with public engagement as we go to the boards and city council. Like I said, we'll be going to planning board for a public hearing on April 4th, city council in late April and early May. There will be a public hearing May 4th in at city council. And then if it gets adopted, then we would use kind of the summer to do the process improvement and preparation, and then the ordinance would go into effect in late summer. And there's a suggested motion for your recommendation, but I can stop there. And if you guys have any other questions, or if we want to go to public comment.
Absolutely. Thank you, Lisa. Before we get into the next section, Terry just reminded us, I am an ADU landlord. I don't think there's any conflict of interest around that. It was approved in 2017 under the current rules, and nothing in this proposed ordinance would affect me in any way, but I am an ADU landlord. Very happy to, by the way. Public comment. I don't think we've ever had public comment in the middle of a meeting. Do we have any public commenters here?
I have one from Mark Fear.
Mark, do you raise your hand if you'd like to testify?
Yes, I did want to testify.
Perfect.
Mark.
Do you want me to put-
Please. Okay.
Hold on one second. Tiffany needs to get set up.
One person stop sharing. They'll get this.
We're doing a little technical thing with the timer, and we're ready in a moment.
No problem.
Okay, you're on, Mark.
All right. So I wasn't intending on testifying about this, but it's hard to miss up an opportunity. I guess I'm talking on two different levels. One is as a Martin Acres resident. And I have to say Martin Acres has a reputation for being one of the capitals of NIMBYism. So I would like to conflate that with that I am definitely not that, and strongly support more ADUs in Martin Acres and all throughout Boulder. This is a great idea. And I know there's going to be a lot of public pushback. I make the mistake of going on Nextdoor and reading the comments there, and usually have to take a shower after reading all the stuff on there. But nonetheless, and I'm sure there'll be other public hearings where you'll hear, well, other bodies will hear lots of pushback against that. Nonetheless, it's important to hear the people who support this. And I really do support any chance of building more affordable housing. And I realize ADUs aren't always affordable housing, but whatever we can get, whatever we can eke out of some additional structure, I want to see that happen. And I'm sure the worst fears that are being propagated out there will not happen in Boulder. I want to also speak, though, as a tenant activist and renter's perspective, because I'm always more concerned about affordable rental housing. I just don't want there to be any misconceptions that this will in any significant way affect rental housing prices. This will not bring down rents, more ADU units. So I hope it doesn't get sold as that this is going to help bring down rents in any kind of significant way. It will not. I can continually believe that the housing market is inelastic, and no matter how much housing we build, it's not going to significantly, if at all, affect housing prices, rental housing more specifically. Nonetheless, again, we need as much affordable housing as we can get. And if we can get just, 10, 15, 20 more affordable units, I really want to see that. And I would actually like to see a tightening of making it more affordable, more units being affordable. And with that, I know I've run out of time, so I'll leave it there.
Thank you, Mark. Appreciate your comments. I think if there were really an explosion of ADUs, it could have some effect on the rental housing market, but I appreciate your point on that. There's more supply maybe than all rent would at least stabilize. I think we are almost ready for one more. Oh, we have another one. I'm sorry. Oh, Lynn. Welcome, Lynn.
Hi.
When we're ready for you, we'll have 3 minutes for public comment. I believe we're ready. Okay, take it away, Lynn.
Yeah, I agree with Mark about the inelasticity of the market. Therefore, I'm not supporting ADUs unless there's a population cap in Boulder. Because exclusively of this inelastic issue, all we're going to do is have more and more unaffordable housing, the way projects like Stoke at 2206 Pearl is proposing as a missing middle, quote unquote, project for 80 to 120% average median income, right?
Area median income.
Area, right, sorry. Area median income. Thank you for that. Yeah. It is not area median income, except for the initial clients that will go in there. And there are 300 square foot units in this place, so people aren't going to stay there forever. And as soon as they move out, guess what? It's market rate. And guess what those 300 square foot market rate units do for the property value? Drive it straight through the ceiling, because it's very inefficient use of space. One person for one bathroom, for one kitchen sink, all of that stuff. They have a bed that rises up to the ceiling to make better use of the space. And they're pushing this through based on the fact that people are going to be more mobile and in the center of town, and they won't be using cars. But guess what? They will be using cars. They will be using Uber to go up to their storage locker because they're living in 300 square feet. And so this is smaller is not less expensive. Smaller actually drives up the cost of housing, up. Because look at that developer. They're making, and these are starting 1,700 to 2,600 a month. But they're going to be much more than that because they're actually market rate. It's an illusion. See through this illusion and population cap. Then I'll support ADUs, but not before that, because otherwise it's just, as far as the eye can see, high-end condos. And the sky's the limit in elastic market. And there's an endless supply of people that want to live here. And
Thank you, Lynn. Your 3 minutes is up. We appreciate your comments.
the costs need to be,
We'll take them into consideration.
thanks.
Do we have any other members of the public who care to comment?
No other hands.
Okay, thank you, Tiffany. Before we move into discussion, I'll just note that really encouraging that this draft ordinance addresses 3 out of our 6 recommendations that we made back in October related to saturation limits, ADU size limits, and streamlining the process of creating ADUs through the regulatory process. It does not address a couple of other things we brought up that are recommended that are important related to parking requirements, eliminating minimum lot sizes, which I think would be maybe not politically, but technically easy fixes. And then one it would be more technically challenging, but is interesting, is to create pre-approved ADU plans to reduce the cost of creating an ADU. So we can perhaps discuss if we want to reinforce those recommendations or let it go. I'd also be curious to hear from staff if you think council is going to be done with ADUs after this happens, or if they would go back and do more.
Sure. So at the study session, I guess we probably had the study session the next day after we met with you. So we talked about having kind of a second bucket of ADU changes, so a future change to focus on, because they wanted us to do a targeted scope for this round. So really focusing on the saturation limit and size limits and clarification items, but they were still interested, or several of the council members were still interested in the other recommendations related to parking and minimum lot size and the pre-approved plans. So they wanted to make sure that we keep that kind of like a running list of future ADU changes to continue, we're doing incremental changes and updates, and also being able to do what we've done with the evaluation, which is go back and see how those changes had impacted the ADUs that are approved. So it's not lost from the overall updates to ADUs, but for the targeted changes this year, we focused on those 4 bullet points I went through.
Great, thank you for that reminder. Just going to take vacation, so
Yeah.
back up to speed on. I'd love to hear from board members about the 3 bucket areas that are addressed in this ordinance, and if you feel they reflect what we've recommended, and or maybe don't go far enough, or if we need to perhaps make any comments about what's being proposed here in addition to part 2. So anyone would like to weigh in on that, now is the time.
I don't know if
Penny, hey.
I guess so my basic thought is paying heed to the old adage of not letting the perfect be the enemy of the good. I think this is a very good step in the right direction. I think it's taking away a lot of the unnecessary restraints to ADUs. I think that there's something to be said for the incremental approach here too, because if you look at this as a work in progress and an ongoing experiment, I think that as you make changes, you realize what other changes you can make that might be better, or that might further help improve things. And while certainly we had other things on our list, it's easy to, as an advisory board, throw out a whole bucket of things that we think could work. But I think that the practical challenges of getting ordinances adopted, which I've experienced for a good portion of my career, is another consideration. And so I'm very, very pleased that so quickly we're sitting here talking about making a recommendation on something that, we're looking to get adopted within the next few months and implemented over the course of the summer. And so I'm very pleased. I think that the changes that they made are all things that really can remove those unnecessary obstacles and can really be helpful. And I'm very supportive of it. And I think that rather than give any sort of caveat of the things we think ought to be done on top of that, I would really like to see our board fully encourage this step in the right direction and the expeditious manner, relatively speaking, of course, but the expeditious manner in which these things were implemented.
Great.
Did we vote on this?
Yeah, we're going to make a recommendation.
Yeah.
Terry, what's your thought? Is that going far enough?
I think it's obviously much better than it used to be, but maybe not as good as it could be. But that seems to be how things go when a lot of compromises are made in anything. I think by far the biggest win is getting rid of the saturation limit.
Yeah.
You can squabble over 50 feet or 100 square feet or 25 feet or 20 feet, but you can make all that work in design. But getting rid of the saturation limit is a huge win. And for that and the other reasons, I fully support the ordinance the way it is, even though I wish there was another 3 or 4 things on it. That's another fight for another day.
Great. Julian, anything to add?
Yeah, I also think that the saturation limit is probably the most important, and then after that, I think that the approval process and clarification of those guidelines is probably like the biggest no-brainer. I think that should be pretty easy. It kind of feels like the way that it is, the city wanted to make it hard for people to get their ADUs approved, so making that easier is probably the first and easiest thing that can be done. And the size limits, I think, is important, but not as important as those first two, just because I feel like density is getting creative with smaller square footage. Not necessarily, I guess, would that allow for like families to live in ADUs, but I think that that one's like a little bit lower on the list, at least for me. But I definitely approve the ordinance. Thank you.
Yeah, so I'm kind of like amazed at how easy it is for us to just talk about stuff here over the course of a year, and it turns into an ordinance the following year. This is fantastic. Have is easy. I'm really excited about these changes. The thought that sort of pops up, surfaces in my brain is I do regret that we're not tackling the minimum parking. But on the other hand, it maybe it was kind of half-baked. I know there was concerns from the community, and we maybe could have hashed that out a bit more. The thought that I'm having that echoes something David Adamson said and Lynn Siegel said is perhaps instead of a cap on population, we should have a cap on the number of cars. And I love David's idea of having affordable housing paired with car sharing and more like as a city, we need more vocabulary about what it means to live without a car and to have allowances for living arrangements that require car sharing or require not owning a car. And so if some of those things sort of got discussed more, then the parking requirement minimum wouldn't feel so threatening, you know, because I feel like that needs to be paired with an understanding that if we're going to have more housing that doesn't make allowances for cars the way we do now, that we need to kind of we need to have more conversation about what that means. So I hope that I hope we come back and revisit the minimum parking requirements. Hope when we do that we add a bit more dialogue about what it means to have less cars and paired with our affordable housing. So
and Phil, keep in mind, we still have the incentive where if you make it affordable, you don't have to provide parking.
That's a good reminder. Thank you.
Aaron, new kid, put you in the spot, everything, Ned?
I agree with most of what everybody said, that that the ordinance makes significant, important changes, and while it's not perfect, let's move this forward with the hope that there's an opportunity to come back and make additional tweaks and changes. So if I'm allowed to vote, I would vote yes.
Have you been sworn in?
I have been sworn in.
Well, you're allowed to vote. Wow. Anybody else have other?
Yeah, I have one more comment. So you mentioned that there's going to be some engagements with the community. What is it going to, are they going to be open houses or what did you call them?
Yeah, we'll have office hours. So Carl
Office
and I are
hours, yeah.
available to answer questions or talk more with things. We also had a community event. I actually didn't have that on the slide, but back in February where we talked about the ADU ordinance and then the zoning for affordable housing. So we were able to have that conversation too.
I don't know if there's opportunity for, or a need for help from us in terms of support as you get pushback on this ordinance, but I just want to offer my own personal support. However I can help, I'd be happy to answer questions or, whatever,
Great, thanks.
Now, if we approve this tonight, you take it to planning board?
Yes,
If they approve it, you take it to council?
exactly.
Okay, cool.
Yeah.
Cool.
I want to remind everybody that we are citizens as well as board members, and if you care to comment to a counselor or write a letter to Daily Camera, your own name, not representing HAB, I mean, people could listen to those comments, and I hear back from council members when I send letters. So encourage you to do that. We don't have to limit our activism to this room. Wow. Well, I think we have really good consensus. around this. I'm really impressed by the streamlining list. Not enough of an expert to know if it's too far or not far enough, but it sounds like a lot of good common sense. Reminds me, you sometimes read about these archaic ordinances, like you can't have a cat on your head in public. Just get rid of them. So that's really a great and very well considered, I think. I think we're ready to consider a recommendation support of that. Anyone like to propose some language along those lines?
Well, they had drafted language. You guys had
Oh,
a,
yeah, but we need to make a recommendation, like we support this. And by the way, don't forget the other stuff for whatever it's, maybe a little more formal.
I like the others.
They're looking for recommendation on this, correct? Yeah.
I'd like to
Planning board.
propose we use the wording up there on the screen.
Oh, my God, where'd that come from?
I second that.
I'd like to take credit for the proposed wording.
All right, is everybody like that?
I second that. I'm glad to give Philip credit for it too. That's.
Sorry, I do not want credit. I'm sorry.
It's like a TV dinner. Wonderful.
But yeah, I love to just support it as is and you know, certainly we've developed good line of communication with councils, but particularly on this issue and with staff as well. And you know, I think we all understand, I feel confident staff and council understand that this is first step. You know, we don't want to put this issue to bed for the next 10 years, but it's a good first step and let's just, you know, support it as is.
Second. Did we create a motion?
Okay, I think we have a motion and a second. All in favor?
I
believe that's unanimous 6-0 vote in support of this recommendation of planning board. So thank you all. Thank you, Lisa.
Thank you.
thank you, Lisa.
Lisa.
And yeah, have recommends and good action.
I just want to say as that this has been one excellent work from staff. And I attribute so much of the speed, and I consider this wildly speedy in my experiences with other city processes, that this has been, you know, fantastic. And I attribute it a lot to this board putting this out there and making this a topic of discussion and an issue. And I think it's taken the stature from somewhat drifting and marginalized to an actual real advisory board that has real influence. So I give kudos to staff and this board. And you know, I get my bite at the apple April 4th on my commentary on this, but in general, I'm super supportive of the work staff's done. And this is the win. It's like the Super Bowl win. You know, it's like, well, that was kind of a funny call. I wish it went a different way, but it's a win, by God. So anyway, I commend you all.
Thank you for those comments, Mark. And again, thank you to the staff for great work, and look forward to seeing more ADUs and more ADU ordinance updates in the future. So let's hope planning board does some good things with this.
Yeah, thanks for all of your input, both September, January. You guys definitely had a big influence on it, so appreciate it.
Great. I believe that brings us to item B, zoning for affordable housing. This is an item for feedback, and Carl Kyler is going to present on this, and then we'll have some conversation.
All right, thank you. Thanks for having me. I'm Carl Geiler, Senior Policy Advisor, Planning and Development Services. You'll remember that we talked about this on January 25th of this year and talked about kind of the broad array of things that we could be looking at, either from changing zoning or changing parking requirements to really remove zoning barriers to try to get more housing opportunities in the city, particularly affordable housing. So I'm here tonight with more information that may confuse you, so I'll try to do my best to make it less confusing. But there's a lot to swallow, so I'm going to go through, but certainly interrupt if you have any questions. So the purpose of tonight is to have a discussion with the Housing Advisory Board on the zoning for affordable housing project. and basically convey the feedback that we get from HAB to city council. We're actually going to go to city council tomorrow night and do a study session on this very topic. So we're looking forward to conveying the feedback to them. As far as how this presentation is going to go, I'm just going to give a little bit of background on the project, and then I'm going to go pretty deep into residential density, like how it's calculated in the city, because there are some expectations that we talked about at the last meeting that make it pretty challenging to make some of the changes that we've been hearing from this board, some members of planning board, and some members of city council. So we wanted to make it really clear about how density works. It's not to say that we would never do these things. It's just, it's a much more broad effort that would be necessary to make some of the changes. So we want to broaden that understanding. So based on the research that we've been doing and diving into the land use code, we've developed some potential options that we wanted to float by city council to give us direction and moving forward. Then I'm going to share some of the feedback that we've been hearing thus far, talk about next steps, and then we'll lead to deliberation. So the questions we have for HAB tonight is, does HAB have any comments or questions related to how residential density is calculated? So I'll go through that section and then we'll pause at that part. And then I'll go into the potential options. And a lot of the analysis and the discussion about density leads to those potential options. So the second question is, which potential option should be the focus of any further analysis, outreach, or ultimately ordinance development? Obviously, if you have other ideas, we're open to those as well, and we can vet those with council and the community. So going into the background, this is the problem statement we set out for the project. It kind of applies to a lot of the housing related land use code changes that we're looking at right now. So obviously the cost of housing in the community creates many barriers to many people having the ability to live and stay in Boulder. So this is the same problem statement that we're using for the occupancy project, as well as the housing for or zoning for affordable housing. So we're trying to broaden housing opportunities in Boulder. So City Council initiated this project at the 2022 retreat. What they asked us to do is basically evaluate the land use code with the intent of removing zoning barriers to more affordable units and smaller modest size units. So these are the goals of the project that we have created for this project to help guide it through. And again, this is all in the memo in detail. And just to make it clear tonight, what do we mean by using the term affordable housing? We mean a number of different things in this particular discussion. So there's kind of three different tiers that we're talking about. Firstly, there's permanently affordable housing. So this is like deed restricted housing that's affordable in perpetuity. It's monitored and administered by our housing department through the inclusionary housing program. There are independent quasi-public agencies that provide affordable housing in the community in conjunction with Boulder. So that's one category. The next category is just affordable, attainable housing. So any households that don't pay more than 28 to 30% of their income on housing. We also mean market rate modest size housing, like I said. So we want to create zoning conditions that encourage more smaller units, which are just inherently more affordable, or comparatively more affordable than the larger floor plate units that our zoning tends to encourage. So I'll talk about that in this presentation, share with you some calculations that show that that's something that we need to look at. So the point that we're trying to get across tonight is allowing more housing by relaxing some density restrictions in parts of the city will encourage more modest sized and modestly priced market rate units in the city. And then the more housing that you can get through a project means the more housing units that would be subject to the inclusionary housing program. So 25% of any housing that's provided is subject to IH. So allowing more housing is going to get you more IH housing. But it also means more cash in lieu if they don't do the provision of the units on site. And one thing we wanted to make clear, and you probably already know this, but a lot of that cash in lieu is very important and can be leveraged in a number of different ways to actually make the money more through going through grant funding with the federal government or the state that can actually get you more units than would be required on site. So that's something that we wanted to make clear through this project. You're probably aware of this, maybe even better than I am. Proposition 123 was a housing related proposition that passed last November by the state. So it's create a state affordable housing fund that dedicates state income to fund housing programs in a number of different ways. I think the information is it's bringing in roughly 290 million a year that can be put into grant programs, affordable housing equity programs, a number of ways to like help out local governments, like relook at their zoning like we're doing now to help remove a lot of zoning barriers, and also just a number of shifting money towards programs that help address homelessness. So this is something that our city manager's office and Housing and Human Services are working actively with the state to figure out how to best implement it. So this is like an ongoing thing that we're going to be working with. And there's also some land use packages that are being proposed by the state. I think it might have even dropped today from the governor about, some standards that are in draft form that may end up applying to the state. So we're all monitoring those changes closely. So moving to the local level, obviously the thing that gives us the most guidance in this community is the Boulder Valley Comprehensive Plan. We have a very broad array of things that we look at in the comprehensive plan, and where it gives us a vision for the community and addresses a number of things like land use, housing, transportation, mental well-being of the community, and it gets implemented in a number of different ways. Obviously, the focus that I'm going to be talking about tonight is through the development standards and zoning, but basically the land use code that we work with every day is implementing the comp plan. But we have to always be updating the land use code to be consistent with the comp plan. So that's something that we're doing in a number of different code changes. But we always have to make sure that whatever code changes we do are consistent with the BVCP. So obviously housing affordability and diversity is a major focus area of the BVCP. So if you open up the plan, some of the beginning pages talk about these are the major focus areas. So this is just a narrative from that page that talks, this is like a major focus for Boulder. And then there's a number of relevant Boulder Valley Comprehensive Plan policies that we look at. So obviously we're looking at the jobs housing imbalance, preservation and support for residential neighborhoods. And there's a number of different housing related policies in section 7 about trying to look at all a multi-pronged way of getting more affordable housing in the community. All right, so now I'm going to jump into residential density. So that's basically the number of dwelling units per acre. Again, this could be kind of complex, so certainly interrupt me if you have any questions.
Carl, are you going to address density and intensity?
Yes.
Good.
Exactly.
I still can't figure that one.
I'm glad you asked. Yes.
Okay. Thank you.
So starting at the really high level, we have land use designations in the comp plan. So this is where we have different land use categories from residential to business to industrial to mixed use. It sets the broad vision for different areas of the city. So it's this color coded map. And you can see that obviously we're focusing a lot on the residential areas. So much of the land in the city of Boulder is really set for low density or very low density residential. That's the pale yellow and the yellow. You get into medium density in the orange areas, and then high density is more of that beige color. But you can see that the low density residential areas are a large swath of the city in terms of land area. Yes.
Do you have the percentages associated with each of these colors? I'd love to see a pie chart.
We do have those. I don't have it as part of this presentation, but it is pretty.
Two ways of crunching it. One is land mass and the other would be like what's the percentage of people that live in the low density?
Yeah, that's actually a really good point.
I'll write that down.
And we also have it broken down by sub-community too. So you can look at different parts of the community. That was part of the last comp plan update.
Nice.
Yeah, we do have those numbers. I do have to kind of look them up. Yeah.
Manufactured housing, that like, oh, mobile home.
Yeah, that was created several years ago because there was concern about losing the affordable housing that comes in manufactured mobile homes. So in order to protect them, they created that land use categories as an overlay over a lot of the mobile home parks that we have in the city. So these are excerpts from the BVCP that focus on the different land uses. So if you go in the plan, I think it's like page 70 something, it has the different color coded areas and it sets out the vision, what are the characteristics of that. But particularly in the low density areas, it has a limitation. And it says very low density is 2 dwelling units per acre or less. And then low density is 2 to 6 dwelling units per acre. And then when you get to medium density, it's 6 to 14 dwelling units per acre. And then high density is 14 dwelling units or more. So where we kind of bump up against, you know, some of the requests for like, well, let's reconsider our single family neighborhoods, you know, allow more housing types or try to allow more missing middle housing. We do butt up against these limitations. So that's the one thing that we wanted to talk about tonight. So this shows you mixed density and high density. So all this translates down to the actual zoning. So if you go in and you look at those lower density areas, they're typically the RR zones, which is rural residential. RE is residential estate. RMX is mixed residential, and then RL is low density residential. So you can see that the RR zones are less than 2 dwelling units per acre. And corresponding in the code, the way that that's achieved is there's a minimum lot size in RR of 30,000 square feet per unit. So that's like how the zoning works. RE is in the 2 to 6 dwelling units per acre range, but it has a 15,000 square foot minimum lot size. And then when you get into the RL zones, there's 2, RL1 and RL2. That's in the 2 to 6 dwelling units per acre range. But they accomplish that density differently. So RL1 is kind of like your post-World War II neighborhoods where they had a minimum lot size of 7,000 square feet per unit. You'll see a lot of the older subdivisions, kind of like Martin Acres is an example of that, achieve that 2 to 6 dwelling units per acre. When you get to RL2, that was created in the 1970s when open space was really popular. They wanted to use open space as a means of regulating density. So in that zone, it's 6,000 square feet of open space per lot. So it either can be on the lot or averaged in a development. So in RL2 areas, you'll notice those neighborhoods like Greenbelt Meadows, if you know that area, or try to think of some other examples. A lot of the fringe areas along the open space that were developed in the 70s, like Devil's Thumb, a lot of South Boulder, those are open space regulated districts. So they have the same density, even though that zone actually allows attached housing. It's one of the only low density zones that allows attached. But it has a lot of open space, so it evens out with the density of those zones.
Sorry, Carl, what about Wendland Hills, which is Nathan's?
A lot of that RL2.
Has a lot of attached housing, a lot of open space.
Yep, that's RL2.
But was that all done under PUD or is?
Yeah, most of RL2, I would say, is done under PUDs.
So they weren't really following by the book zoning, they were creating their own template.
Yeah, a lot of it's like averaging the open space, like they all have to meet that minimum. They have to average 6,000 square feet of open space per unit, but you might see a lot of smaller lot sizes. Like there's no minimum lot size in RL2, for instance. It's incredibly challenging zone. I could talk about it for an hour. It's one of the most draining zoning constructs we have in Boulder, I'll have to say, based on my time here. Like, we're trying to figure out what can happen in those zones if they want to make changes. It's very, very challenging because everyone has a slightly different PUD. So it's something that we're tackling as well as.
There were some good outcomes using that example of different sizes of housing, different affordability levels.
Yeah, I mean, there are definitely some positives in terms of the diversity of housing types that are permitted in RL two, but it is challenging when you're trying to do all the math for the open space and everything like that.
Carl, can I interrupt? So if you guys aren't tracking what a planned unit development is or PUD,
Yeah, I'm sorry. Yeah.
the main point that Carl is trying to make is that the comprehensive plan is what sets the policy and the code is what implements it. And the code is this minimum square footage for lots or the open space requirement is just implementing that policy.
Can you,
Makes sense? That's all. I just,
that's great. Can you remind me, like, how often is the comp plan updated and when's the next one?
It's updated every 5 years, so it'd be like 2025 is the next update. So I think that's the point we're trying to make tonight is that, you know, changes in a lot of these single family neighborhoods is going to require a much larger effort to make it happen. And also just, you know, a lot of community engagement. You know, I think through a comp planning process, I think the city, if this is something that the city council or having, you know, ask city council to make it a priority, the council could tell us, you know, this is something we want done as part of an update and start exploring changes to allowable housing types and potentially density in these areas. But it would have to come from the policy level first, you know, going through that update. And then it would have to be implemented through the zoning, whatever that public process, you know, whatever the outcome of that is. So it's not just a simple thing of, oh, just change the minimum lot size and allow more units. It would not be consistent with the current comp plan. So that's the one thing we wanted to make really clear through this process, because I know there's been a lot of requests for that. So where we're trying to steer things is where we do have opportunities to make changes, not to say we'll never do those things. It's just there are some opportunities now that we can do because there are parts of the comp plan that don't have density. And that's what this slide really shows is that there are some zones or there are some land uses and zones that don't have density caps where there are density limits in the code, but because the land use doesn't cap the density, those are the kind of zones we can look at and go, okay, maybe we can make some changes to that zoning to allow more housing. So interestingly enough, a lot of those zones where those opportunities exist are in areas where the comp plan designates for more mixed use and more housing. So like the Boulder Valley Regional Center and in the neighborhood centers of the city or along some corridors in the city, those zoning districts, we do have the ability to make changes to try to encourage more housing. So now this map is actually from the BVCP and shows some of the different neighborhood centers. So we're really going to focus as part of this project because it's something that council wanted some kind of fast changes that could be made to the code to remove some zoning barriers. So that's really informed a lot of the potential options that we're looking at. Density versus intensity.
Sorry. You just a few minutes ago, you said this is the main thing I want you to come away with. And I'm trying to pay attention, but I'm hearing a little bit of word soup, but I kind of just want to summarize what I think I heard you say in the last couple minutes. So the Boulder Valley Comprehensive Plan, it's not just a vision, but it's a set of kind of constraints under which we think about changing city ordinances with respect to zoning. So I think you said the CP has specific things it says about density levels at certain zonings. And so you're kind of steering away from city council tackling these different zoning designations on its own, independent of whatever the BVCP might say, just because that's kind of the precedent and because that's easier to be accomplished kind of politically and mechanically. Is that a summary of what you said?
That's the vision.
Yeah.
So the vision that we're hearing from, you know, some of these boards and council is different than what's in the the comp plan. So what we're trying to say is the vision needs to be changed in the comp plan through a public process before any of those zoning type changes can be implemented. I mean, that's kind of like, we have a pretty strong comprehensive plan as a community. Not a lot of communities have that. A lot of communities have general plans that are like these like lofty statements, but a lot of them, it just goes up on the shelf. They don't consult it that much. In Boulder, it gets adopted by ordinance, so it has a legal backing that we implement through a lot of our applications like site review and things like that. So we do have to make sure that it's consistent.
So when you talk about the BBCP, I find the BBCP has lots of vision. But it doesn't always, within the BBCP, that vision doesn't always follow along with the actual land use designations that are mapped in the BBCP. Is that?
I mean, I think there's a lot of, I would say, competing policies in the plan, and we have to balance those on everything we do. But I think it's in that balance that I think we have some flexibility. The land use designations are not that flexible though.
No.
I mean, that's why we're kind of pointing that out as something that would have to be relooked at, you know?
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Yeah, so again, I'm glad you brought up density versus intensity. So what I put on this slide is that the city regulates the amount of development in the city in different zoning districts using density and intensity. So in some cases, some zones just use density and some use intensity and some use both. And the difference really is that density is basically the number of dwelling units that are permitted on a property. So the dwelling units per acre. So density is kind of a subset of intensity. Intensity is just overall activity, like bulk, how much can be built on a lot. So like I said, there's different zones that regulate it differently. So some zones have just density limits and nothing else. Some have intensity limits. So intensity limits are like the floor area ratio. So you quantify the total amount of floor area that's built and you divide by the land area, and that gives you a number. There are limits in the code, like the FAR limits that regulate how much FAR can be on a site. Some zones have FAR, some don't. Then we have open space requirements. We have parking requirements, height limits, setbacks. There's a number of things that kind of whittle away at how much can be built on a property. So what this graph is showing is that, like, you can see a 0.5 FAR is pretty low. Like you can only build, like a one-story building. And if some of that land area has to be taken up by parking or landscaping or open space, that's going to constrain how much can be built. If more parking is required, and you can do 2 stories, it might push that massing over to the right, like you can see, or in another scenario, you can see a 2.0 FAR. If like we didn't have open space or parking requirements or no setbacks, they could build 2 stories and cover the entire lot. But when there's other intensity factors that fill up the lot, it pushes the development up. And you can see obviously like height is a big factor in the city of Boulder. We have a 55-foot height limit, so you can only get 4 or 5 stories. So we wouldn't be seeing an 8-story building, but that 8-story building is equivalent in FAR to those 2 stories on the left, or that middle one is kind of like what you see in, Boulder Junction or downtown. That's typically a downtown building is around 2.0, maybe more, a little bit over 2.0 FAR, and you can get about 4 stories in there. So FAR is kind of a gauge of how much visual mass you're seeing, but it can look differently depending on a number of factors in the design. So, yes.
So if we talk about density and we're thinking about like micro units or single room occupancy, is there something in the Boulder Valley plan that says you can't have either of those?
No, it doesn't say that. I mean, it doesn't really get into the detail of like efficiency living units. A unit is a unit. We do have something in our land use code where 2 efficiency living units are equivalent to 1 unit. So that because of they're small, it was determined that their impact is like the same as one unit to have two. So it's looked at differently, but I don't know that the comp plan goes into that level of detail on, you know, micro units and things like that.
But if there's a dwelling unit limitation, that would factor in.
Yeah, it would.
And parking.
In practical use, people can bring up this new micro unit project on East Pearl. 2200 block, I believe. Is that one being governed by density or intensity?
Right on Pearl.
The 22nd and Pearl that we did the concept review on, the 44 micro units.
Do you remember what the zoning was?
I don't. But it was,
Yeah, my guess is that area is like mixed use zoning along Pearl. I'm not sure if that's.
it had ground floor retail.
Yeah, okay, yeah, so that's probably MU3.
Yes.
So MU3 is one of the zones where it doesn't have a dwelling unit per acre limit, but it has an FAR. So like I said, there's a lot of zones like business zones. Some have FAR, some don't.
Right.
I think a lot of the dwelling units per acre limitations are mostly in the residential zones. So again, if you want to dive deep in that, there is a table in the memo.
You know, looking at, for instances, so if I were developing that property under FAR based regulations, I could theoretically do like 3 giant lots, or I could do 44 micro units, which is kind of an interesting example that possibly could be applied in other areas, including single family areas. We can talk about that later.
Yeah,
That's exactly the analysis right there.
yeah,
At 5,000 square feet, it can be 1 unit or it can be, 20 units.
yeah, and all that too. So I think the point I'm trying to make here is that we can make FAR whatever we want without it like finding that it's whether or not it's consistent with the plan. It's the density part that we have to kind of look at a little more creatively, so this table is let me try to describe this the best I can. So one of the things that has prompted this project was the Diagonal Plaza project. So it's a 5.45 acre site right up at Iris and Broadway. And the zoning in that area, it's a neighborhood center, right? So
Iris and 28th Street.
Iris and 28th. Did I say Broadway?
Yeah.
I'm sorry. Thank you. Iris and 28th Street.
The old Sports Authority.
Yeah.
Yep.
That's what people know.
So the first line represents what the zoning is. So it's BC1, so it's community business. It doesn't have an FAR limit, but it has I would say a fairly suburban density limit, right? So it's 1,200 square feet of open space per unit is required, which is kind of like that RL2 example where it's challenging to know exactly what you can even build because it's totally dependent on how you design it. But based on, looking at a number of similar projects, we've made an approximation that probably the most density you could get with that limitation is 22 dwelling units per acre. So based on the 5.45 acres of lot area, you could probably get around 120 units. So when the applicant was looking at the project, that didn't meet a yield that they were looking for. They didn't think that number of units was really what the city wanted for that area. And just the one thing, the next column is basically showing that if you have 120 units there would be 30 units that would be either on-site, affordable, or subject to the cash in lieu fee. So what happened as part of that project is there was actually a special ordinance that was done to allow more units. So I'll get to that. That's the third line down. The second column is something that I think you might know, Terry, because I've heard it a lot from the development community, but like the BR1 zone actually has, and so does RH5, has this density calculation of 1,600 square feet of lot area per dwelling unit. So that equates to 27 dwelling units per acre. So that's considered high density in Boulder and other communities. That's not, it's probably more like medium density. But if you apply that to the Diagonal Plaza example, so a 5.45 acre site, you could get 148 units based on that density limit. And then if you apply the IH requirements, about 37 of those units would be either onsite or cash in lieu. But the thing that's interesting here is that the BR1 zone has a 2.0 FAR limit. So this is where the zoning drives larger floor plate units. So if you take 2.0 and you times it by the 5.45 acres, you get, I think it was like, I did the calculations, about 474,000 square feet. A lot of times developers will try to maximize that FAR as much as they can. So when you get that box and then you divide it by 148 dwelling units, you're going to get like 3,200 to 3,500 square feet per unit. So that's sort of an example of where the zoning really encourages large floor plate units. And it's because of that density calculation. So what they did up at Diagonal Plaza is they took away that density limitation that's in the BC1 zone. They just applied a 15% open space requirement. They actually didn't put an FAR limit, but what was yielded from that was the project that could grow to 282 units, which then yields 70 units that would go into IH or cash in lieu. And when they built it out, it ended up being about a 1.77 FAR. So I think the point is that density limitation that's in BR1 applies in a lot of different zones, and it drives that larger floor plate. So if we got rid of that, you could get more units and you'd get more affordable deed restricted units.
So the Boulder Valley Comp Plan has to get approved by the city and the county. So did the ordinance need to get approved by the city and the county as well?
No, it was a site specific development proposal within the city limits of Boulder. It doesn't include the county at all.
Okay.
How did we do that and avoid being accused of spot zoning?
Nobody cared.
Just no one.
Me.
Okay. Yeah, okay, that's fine.
I mean, again, it like the ordinance changed the zoning, how it applied, but it didn't conflict with the comp plan.
Okay.
Well, you can change it. I mean, it's not illegal to change ordinance or zoning. I mean, it's just when you complain about it, but
But if you change them to apply for a very specific project that benefits a specific developer, then a different developer, you say, hey,
yeah,
I want that. And if you guys, that's spot zoning. So unless it applies to me and my property, which is an equivalent thing, then that's spot zoning. Is that?
well, yeah, that's.
Yeah, you're not a lawyer. Okay. I'm ready to stop.
Great case study, right? And what we're talking about here, because basically there was so much political and public motivation to do something on the site that you literally got to just pick and choose your restrictions or pick and choose what restrictions you wanted to delete, right? Or get rid of. And by picking and choosing this little matrix we have here and getting it to the point where everybody goes, well, that seems like it makes sense there. We won't call it spot zoning. We'll just say it kind of makes sense there,
I think that if it's appropriate to comp plan, and it generally meets the vision for that area and the policies, like they've said, it's not spot zoning.
But this is a great example of remove this restriction, what effect does that have? Remove that restriction, what does effect did it have? And it's really the ends justifying the means, right? You want to see a certain thing there, a certain number of units, a certain type of project, a certain type of whatever. And that's what everybody wanted there. I don't think there's anybody who said we don't want that there. So then how do we get there? Right? How do we get there? We've got to look at all the rules and delete them or add them as needed to get there. I think that's a unicorn, right? That's a very rare situation in Boulder, Colorado. That just does not happen very often. But I think it's a great exercise to go through.
Yeah. So what kind of home size is projected under this 52D dwelling unit per acre scenario.
Well, yeah, I mean, and if you divide, if you applied a 2.0 FAR like I did in the BR one with the number of units that they proposed, it got it down to about 1,200 per unit. So it is a pretty significant
Is
change.
that uniform or is it gonna be like summer?
I mean, it's probably gonna be a mix, but either way, then the zoning no longer drives the larger sized units.
Yeah.
So
There's a couple questions. You said it was built in past tense a couple times. I assume you mean that the plans have been submitted and approved and they're gonna go ahead and build it now? Or
yeah, I'm actually reviewing all the tech docs and stuff. It's not built, but we've seen the plans and everything. Yeah, sorry if I.
That's okay. I just was curious what the stage the project was actually at, I guess.
It's deconstruction, right? It's flat.
And then I have a question about the chart. I kind of assume that BC one means you can have businesses or light industrial or something. I'm not sure what the different kinds of buildings are. And that's not included in this. Or is that, those units include like business establishments as well?
Oh, it's a mixed use zone, so it includes a large list of retail,
So it doesn't have to be dwelling units. They could be shops and.
Oh, yeah. Yeah,
Services.
the emphasis is really on shops in that zone. I mean, actually, a prior city council wanted us to really try to write the zoning in a way that encouraged neighborhood serving uses and then try to get the residential more above retail rather than like entire projects that are residential. That's something that we're also looking at in a separate code change project.
So in your mind, when you go around Boulder Junction, 30th and Pearl over there, I think you see retail and 3-4 stories.
Yep.
Taste. That's what'll be there in like 5 years, 3 years.
Yeah, I just want to know how to read because it says 22 BU. I assume that's dwelling units, but I assume it could actually just be units or. Yeah,
Well, those are all residential dwelling units. It's not a factor of retail spaces or.
Your calculations are pure, it's purely residential. There is no commercial in that.
Yeah, right now we're just looking at.
there's missing data from the chart.
Don't forget that's.
How to describe BC.
Horizontal mixed use. You
Yeah. We got
The big way, you got a coffee shop, there's already a lot there,
Yep,
which
yep.
is what makes it such a win.
It's a great
And
deal,
transit
a great deal.
and your place question.
It's all great, but you have to manipulate the zoning code 6 ways from Sunday to get there. So that's what had to happen, which is fine. I don't think anybody's complaining about that, but that's what had to happen to do it.
Yeah, so I think the point of this is that this is kind of. What steered us towards, maybe we just try to get rid of these density limits, so we remove the barrier. So we can try to encourage more residential and get more housing units in these zones. But what council has asked is that maybe we look at FAR limits for these areas just to govern the scale. So we've given some examples in the packet of what different building sizes look like and everything, so.
Doesn't the height limit do that de facto? I mean, you can't build a Manhattan tower.
Yeah.
FAR,
I mean, yeah, that's obviously a major factor.
but I appreciate what they're trying to do.
Yeah. So, I mean, we've already been doing some questions. Are there any more questions before I move forward or sorry?
No worries.
Not yet. All right, so I'll go into potential options. So again, we're not just looking at density through this, like as council has asked, they've asked us to look at a number of different things. So the theme of the different options that we're looking at tonight relate to adjustments to density where we can do them quickly and relatively easily. Also looking at housing type allowance, which this will touch a little bit on what we talked about at the January meeting about allowing different housing types in zones that only allow single family zones. And then I'll talk about parking modifications. There are some changes that we've identified that we want to float by the board and get feedback on. So as far as density adjustments, this is relating to what we were just talking about. So we've identified a number of different zones that use the 1,600 square feet of lot area per dwelling unit calculation that are generally supposed to be growth areas of the city. So that's the BR1 zone, the RH5 zone, BC2, IG and IM. Also, we've made some recent changes in the code to allow more housing units in the industrial zones. So that also bumps up against this 1,600 square feet of lot area per dwelling unit. So that would be, the industrial zones would also be an opportunity to make this more flexible. So the first proposal, A1, is basically to remove that limit and then add an FAR to regulate intensity. A2 is very similar. It's really just to the BC1 again, which uses that 1,200 square feet of open space per dwelling unit, basically getting rid of that and using FAR to regulate the intensity. So we're recommending that move forward as part of this project, but we can talk about it during deliberation. Housing types, it gets a little trickier. Like I said, in the single family zones, other than RL2, the other zones only allow a single family dwelling unit or an accessory dwelling unit on a lot. So we've been asked to make the code more flexible to allow more duplexes or attached housing. Like we just talked about extensively, we bump up against density limitations because a lot of these neighborhoods in the city are, when they were subdivided originally, maxed out their density. So by adding more of these types of housing types, you inherently bump up against that limit unless you change the comp plan and make those changes from that. We did bring forward an ordinance on this several years ago because there were a number of lots in the rural residential areas that were very large that actually could be subdivided and you could add units. It was, I would say, fairly modest. It was probably in like around 100 or so. So it wouldn't give you too much, but you could make the code more flexible for these types of housing types. So we could change the use table to allow these housing types, but it would still have to meet those minimum lot sizes per unit. So we do have those options up here. Our recommendation at this point is like, there's not a lot of value add in doing this until that broader effort is done. We could, do it, at least open up, the possibility, but B1 and B2, B1 just basically means you could do it, by right. B2 would be like a conditional use process, which would be required to meet some standards. That's what council asked us to do last time. They wanted them to go through conditional use standards to make sure that if they added those types of units, that it would generally appear like a single family house in a single family neighborhood. So that would have to go through a special review. Again, we're not recommending it at this time. We certainly could move forward with it. Like it would be better to do it as part of a bigger project down the road.
Carl, you mentioned that the reason you did bring those forward earlier, right? And there was so much community opposition, the council backed off.
That's right. Thank you. I was trying to block that out of my mind, but yeah, there was a lot of resistance to those changes, and ultimately the council didn't move forward with those changes. Moving on to.
So B3, are you going to get to B3?
Yeah.
Okay, it's fine. Is there any way that just on our screen, we can stop end the transcription?
Yeah, unfortunately, that's the recording.
That's the recording. Okay.
Right, Tiffany, or no? She'll look into that.
Okay.
I think it's pretty easy, and I think you might be receptive to this change based on your interest in micro units. But like right now in our land use code, we call micro units efficiency living units. Several years ago, if you had a project that had more than 20% of the units as efficiency living units, you had to go through a use review process. In the last use standards project that we did in phase 1, we changed that to 40%. We actually proposed getting rid of the use review requirement entirely, but that wasn't supported by council at that time. So this is something that we're kind of bringing back, that we think this would remove a barrier to more smaller units, by getting rid of that use review process. So obviously efficiency living units would still have to meet the density requirements, would still have to meet open space and height and setbacks, FAR, things like that, but we're putting it forward that this option B3 would be removing the use review requirement for that to make it easier for those types of units. And then lastly, talking about parking changes. So we've identified 3. Our code right now, if you look at it, if there's any project that has more than 60% of its units as 1-bedroom units, it actually increases the parking requirement to 1.25 per unit. We're proposing an option here where that could just change to 1, which is similar to any 1 unit. It just would require a lot of additional parking that I think may have made sense, you know, many years ago, but as Boulder has kind of moved towards, you know, putting more units on multimodal corridors and using transit, it doesn't make as much sense. So we're recommending that be changed. The second one is more broad. We've heard a lot of comments from other cities that have considered this, but basically lowering parking requirements for any permanently affordable projects. And that there's interest in doing this. We're not recommending this at this point. We feel that should be handled through a more comprehensive change to our parking regulations. Our concern and reason for not recommending that now is just that if we were to eliminate parking requirements for affordable units or reduce them significantly, that if there were any externalities or spillover parking from an affordable project, that would actually be detrimental to the public's, you know, acceptance of trying to get more affordable units. So we do have some hesitation with that recommendation. I mean, we think it should be handled more, that we're trying to look at permanently affordable units like equally to market rate units and not treat them so differently. So we do have some hesitation with that. Again, we think it should be best handled as part of a more comprehensive look at our parking regulations, which we've been doing on and off for several years. We haven't moved forward with it. But certainly open to your viewpoints on that issue. C3 is we do parking reductions at the city of Boulder. They're fairly common. But what we do have is we have an administrative process for parking reductions up to 25% of the required parking that can be done at a staff level. But if you do any parking reduction as part of a residential project, it automatically requires site review. So this could also pose a barrier to some affordable housing. So what we're recommending is allowing residential projects up to a 25% parking reduction to be considered through an administrative process rather than site review. And that would be a change.
It might help to explain the difference between administrative use and site review.
Sure.
Yeah, real quick.
Yeah. So an administrative review is an application that just gets reviewed by city staff. We review it against specific criteria. If the project meets the criteria, we can approve it. If it doesn't, we deny it. It isn't like a land use review. So land use review includes site review and use review, which are a much larger project process. So a use review and a site review require public notice. And then they require a call up and appeal periods after any staff decision. Some automatically require planning board review. So it's a much more extensive review. As part of a site review and use review, there's a lot more requirements that apply, but an administrative review is usually pretty focused to specific criteria that can be used.
So let me talk about like a use by right. Is that
Administrative.
administrative? Okay.
Yeah, use by right is like, that really means like someone can just come in with a building permit and do it.
So if you're trying to prevent NIMBYs from preventing a project, it would either be use by right or administrative rather than the use review or the site review.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, with any kind of land use review, obviously the scope of the project broadens and it does bring in, you know, the element of people commenting on the project, or any staff decision that's made on a land use review can be called up
Okay.
to planning board.
Okay.
So if you implemented C3, we would still see those administrative approvals come for planning board for possible call up.
No,
No.
it would be an administrative review. They wouldn't.
And so there, okay, so, yeah, there, it would be part of that giant amount of work you guys do that we never see and never have an option to see. Okay.
Can I ask a question about C1? So if I own a large apartment building with a bunch of one bedroom units in it, and you make this change, now I've got more parking than I'm required to have. Am I allowed to eliminate some of that, and repurpose that space?
Yeah, if we changed the code and they came back in and said, I used to require 88 parking spaces, but now with this code change, I only need, 61. And they want to like add landscaping, absolutely. Good. So just to go over some of the community engagement and feedback we've received. So this is a relatively new project compared to the ADU project and even occupancy. So we have been kind of getting the word out on the project through our newsletter. We've been having conversations with interested persons and groups through the course of the project. We did hold a public engagement event on February 22nd where we talked about all these housing related code changes to get feedback. So we're going to continue doing engagement. We really want to hear what you have to say so that we can convey that to council, and then council will tell us which options to really focus on, and then we'll go out to the community with those options in more detail. So like Lisa said, we're going to be holding open houses and office hours in coming weeks and months, probably doing some sort of Be Heard Boulder questionnaire to gauge where people are on these particular ideas. This is some of the feedback that we've been hearing just broadly about the housing issues. Obviously, there's a lot of folks in the community that, agree that there's a need for more housing in the community to help with the supply and the demand, and hopefully try to get at the housing prices, just adding more opportunities for people to have places to stay. That we've heard that it's consistent with our housing and racial equity goals. We've also been hearing, folks that are opposed to the changes. And like we heard about the on the ADUs topic about the inelastic market, that increasing housing supply alone will not make a difference, and that the demand is so high to live in Boulder that it won't make an impact on housing prices, that we'd actually be getting more expensive housing. That's something we've been hearing. We've been hearing suggestions that our focus shouldn't be so much on physically adding units, but really just trying to be more robust on the in lieu fees and the commercial linkage fees, like increasing them, or looking at rental, controlling rental prices somehow, and trying to get more deed restricted affordable units in the city. And we've been hearing a lot of concern about, changes that could impact single family neighborhoods. In particular, there's a lot of concern about allowing different types of housing types in certain areas of the city. So that's what we've been hearing so far. So as far as next steps, tonight, March 22nd with HAB, tomorrow, city council study session. Then following that, we'll have a little bit more idea of what to focus on. So we're going to continue analysis of the options and continue with outreach. We'll be going to planning board on April 18th to talk about this project. And as we get the input, we're going to start the ordinance development, but we really wanted to do a check-in with council on June 15th to go, like, this is what we've been hearing from the communities. This is what the boards have been saying. Where do you really want us to go with this? And then the plan is to go to planning board with an ordinance in August, and then city council in September. And we certainly can swing back here once we flesh things out a bit more. So that leads us to the primary question tonight, is which potential options should be the focus of any further analysis, outreach, or ultimately ordinance development. So that concludes my presentation. Been answering questions, but happy to answer more. Are you more confused or less confused?
Less confused. Great thing. I'll start, do general comments, by saying that I think that what is happening potentially in Diagonal Plaza is like a really great guidepost toward the future. And I brought this up numerous times. It had not such an original thought, but you know, the amount of surface parking in Boulder that's not even used is, you know, just a waste and the potential to create more housing. Maybe even using that model as more of a template, so it wouldn't be spot zoning anymore. It would be like a standard.
Not spot.
So, you know, and that's an area with single family neighborhoods are not much of a factor in terms of playing about it. Because they're not there, and you're introducing the idea of a 15-minute neighborhood into an area that's strictly commercial now. So there's some way of replicating that through policy initiatives and for it. And then I think it's worth fighting the fight. You know, it could take time to diversify single family neighborhoods with more housing types. And as we've, you know, heard from experts at these meetings, and common sense also says simply subdividing a single family lot into two duplexes just creates more expensive housing, not at the highest level, but still in the millions. So like, what else can we do that will introduce other housing types into single family neighborhoods without completely changing their character? The other point I've hammered on somewhat is that under the current system of small houses being torn down and replaced with much larger houses, neighborhood character is being compromised with no public benefit to speak of, really. So if there's a way of addressing that, not to prohibit that type of housing entirely, but to allow that to create more diverse options, that I think that's a very general direction, but that's one that I think we should continue to look at and have. And it sounds like we would be shooting towards a July timeframe for recommendation to planning board. And then finally, again, this came up at the last meeting, if there's a way of helping the community visualize the kind of options as you diversify housing types on lots. It's just the textbook new urbanist approach, but actually incorporating the housing types into the code so that people can say, oh yeah, it's going to be a cluster of cottages. It's going to be townhomes along a landscape alley or a window for, you know, whatever it is, like going, maybe it's a form-based zoning approach, but something that's more fine-grained detail that actually allows people to visualize something other than FAR and dwelling units per acre.
Yeah.
You know, again, not an original thought, but I think an area worth exploring. So I'll hear from other members of the board what we heard tonight and where you think we might be going.
I have a pile of comments. One of the main takeaways that I'm a little discouraged by your on the balance, your recommendations. I would love for us to see, I know there's several people on city council and you know, there's a lot more discussion in the air about reforming single family zoning. And I'm discouraged that that's off the table. But so my takeaway feels like, okay, I need to understand the process for a Boulder Valley comprehensive plan, how that gets updated, how we need to get involved with conversations at that level to have recommendations ready. I mean, I just don't know how that works at all, but like, that's like where my brain goes as I'm listening to you. It's like, okay, it seems like to actually move the community forward on this, that's where it's at with respect to single family zoning. Is that a good takeaway for me to have? Okay, so like, let's crack that nut and figure out.
I totally agree that we shouldn't give up on addressing single family housing reform.
Oh, yeah, I don't want to, yeah.
Yeah, I agree with you.
Right, yeah. I mean, maybe we can see that the timing's not great because of the way BVCP is currently written. I don't know. Yeah, there's that too. But so, and some of the things that kind of drive me crazy is, the notion that the housing market is inelastic. We have had decades of policy that constrain supply and increase demand. And now we're trying to think about ways to increase supply kind of in a lot of ways, kind of at the margins. We're a little bit here, a little bit there. And we say, markets don't apply here because the demand is so great. And I just want to push back on that anytime someone says that smaller is not more expensive, smaller reduces demand. People want large houses. If we're going to continue to have zoning that encourages very large houses on large lots, that's a driver of housing prices for sure. I think it remains to be seen whether they can squeeze the kind of money they're hoping to get out of 300 square foot units at 22 Pearl. Maybe there are limits on how much you can charge for 300 square feet. So I don't think it's a done deal that they're gonna make that kind of money. Surprise, I could be surprised, but and I know that's kind of beside the point. The thing I really want to kind of circle back to that was sort of absent from this presentation is some of the community conversations that have been taking place. In particular, I'm thinking of the Housing Equity Symposium that took place a couple of years ago related to how our history of zoning relates to racist policies and exclusionary principles. And you never once used the phrase exclusionary zoning, which is the way I'd like to characterize it. So we have a real crisis of housing affordability, of wealth inequality, climate change. I mean, we need to give people options to live in low carbon footprint neighborhoods. And anyways, I appreciate that you're being very pragmatic and you want to do something this summer. And there's an aspect of that of, okay, let's get into a cadence of updating the zoning every now and then. It seems like it's been static for a long time, and I don't know the history of how often zoning gets changed, but maybe if ADUs get changed this year, they were changed a few years ago, maybe they'll get updated again. Maybe if we get into a cadence of updating zoning based on how the Boulder Valley Comprehensive Plan gets updated, then that's a good thing. So I don't want to just dump cold water on what you're doing, but man, I want to really fundamentally wrestle with single family zoning in the way that's excluded people and the long legacy it has of the history, that the historical context that it comes out of. And it's kind of it's really like this living legacy of our racist history and the segregation that we still see in our society today. So whatever I can do, man, I want to get those conversations going.
Others? Thank you, Bill.
I was just going back through, I finally found your items, C 1, 2, 3, the recommendations. The thing that seems to be missing from the parking question is the requiring or disallowing parking to be joined to a unit, or requiring separation, unbundling from your residential dwelling units. And that can go a long way towards when you have structured underground parking and suddenly someone comes with a bike and a bus pass.
you know, that goes a long way towards affordability. If that underground parking spot costs the developer 80 grand or something to build. So anyway, was there any discussion of restricting the ability of a developer to include parking in their, you know, or that require them to separate it out?
Not specifically as part of this project. We have been looking at updating the parking code for several years. We haven't had, number one, the capacity to do it. Number two, we haven't had the guidance from council to make it a priority. But that was something that we were considering as part of that project. We've done pretty extensive data gathering on parking supply and demand in the community as part of a parking update that we did over several years, but with COVID and everything, it's been kind of pushed to the side, but it's something that we're thinking about.
And so just going off of what Philip was saying, B1, which is allow duplexes or attached housing types by right in RL, RR, and RE zones in the use table with no change to density, et cetera, et cetera. And then your response is no. Would you recommend it? No. There would be little value in this change as not many units could be added. So I don't understand why not many units would, why would not many units be added?
Because the areas where that would be implemented have already been maxed out largely in their density with their minimum lot size. Is that when they subdivided the neighborhoods originally. So there we did an analysis of what properties could actually add units. Like I said, it came out for a very large land area. It came to about 100 units.
Okay, so if we look at North Boulder, east of Broadway, north of Norwood, and west of 26th Street, there are a lot. It seemed like there are a lot of lots there that could be, and maybe this is maybe an entirely different issue that could be subdivided, could be subdivided and then a duplex or a triplex be built. Is that an RR, RL, or RE zone?
I think a lot of those zones in that area are RR, if I recall. I can actually go back. I can try to find the memo where we did the data analysis of how many lots. We looked at all the minimum lot sizes of the lots up there and tried to find the ones that could be end up being subdivided. That's why it didn't seem to yield all that many.
All that many, huh?
I understand what you're saying about density limits in these established areas, but could that be changed in the next comp plan update as the forerunner of future changes?
Yeah, I mean, that's
what
if that's something that the city council instructs us to do as part of the comp plan update, then there would be an outreach process with neighbors and with the community to relook at those areas, and it could result in changes to the land use designations in those areas.
So in theory, that could happen in 2 years, understanding there's political challenges, but.
Yeah, and I think it would be a very large effort in terms of the outreach and also just like in talking about kind of what types of housing, how would you fit in with the neighborhood character? I think part of that discussion might be that there might have to be some design standards that get developed to ensure that those areas, any additional housing units are going to fit in and be at a smaller scale. So it is a pretty intensive effort, but it certainly could happen.
Yeah, and that was my earlier point, that there are these prototypes of, general infill in neighborhoods that, could help facilitate this process, and maybe even public would be accepting.
I can actually, I think this is the right graph for the right tables. This is what we shared with council several years ago, where we looked at the different zoning districts and you can see the potential additional dwelling units in that particular option out of all those zones was a total of 132.
Carl, to me, it feels like this analysis is broken down into kind of the single family neighborhoods and then the more commercial corridor with the business. It's kind of two different things. It seems like your recommendations are more weighted towards the commercial corridor, as I'll call them, which I think is great, by the way. Because irrespective of what nobody can really answer this question. What do we want Boulder to be in 30 years or 50 years, right? Do we want to be a Portland? Do we want to be a San Jose? What do we want to be? But I think I know what we don't want to be is we don't want to have a bunch of 1960s, 70s, and 80s single-story strip malls up and down 28th Street, you know, and 30th Street and right. And I think in the last 25 years, if you look at the major changes, it's amazing to me always for people to say, Boulder didn't change, Boulder didn't all grow. Look around. Do you know how much has changed in 25 years? You take East Pearl, West Pearl, North Broadway, 30th and Pearl. I mean, it's amazing how much has changed in how much development and growth, and it's amazing. But I think it's clear that that's the direction we want to go, right? So we want to, whether we like it or not, or that's an individual opinion, but the direction is to redevelop these parking lots and single-story strip malls into something better, right? And if that's small units, big units, retail on the first floor, or not, something better than what's there. And I think everybody agrees on that. And I think a lot of your, whether it's 3 stories or 4 stories, that's individual opinions, but I think a lot of your recommendations and the business zoning does that, will help do that, right? It will, by eliminating 1,500 square feet of open space per unit or below whatever the restrictions are. I think that's great. And I think that simplifying those zoning rules or unrestricting them, if you will, is going to help in 28th Street and 30th Street and Arapahoe and all those places that we all know when we drive by, we're like, God, that's a really old, ugly building. It should be something better there. I mean, really, you know, I'll help do that. But I do agree with everybody else. So I fully support all that. I do agree with everybody else that we can't just forget about the single family zoning neighborhoods. I've done it and I've seen it. You have this big old lot, you build this big old house and you get this big old yard and you're like, just watering this grass, you know, it's like something else could be there that's just so much better than this big old yard with big old grass because my FAR was restricted or I can only put 1 unit here or right. That's my opinion. I think we can't sleep on, we can't forget about single family neighborhoods. There's so much opportunity there. And I don't know how the 130 unit calculation came up, but I see there's thousands of single family lots in this town that could be, what do you call it? Gentle what?
Gentle infill.
Gentle infill. I think that's a great phrase, by the way. Gently infilled. That makes sense? But in a nutshell, I support this whole process. I think it's great. There are these practice in every one of these zonings. I call them the restrictor, right? You match, you meet the FAR, you meet the density. Oh no, there's an open space requirement, or oh no, there's a parking requirement. I mean, why in the world should we have a 1.25 parking space requirement for a 400 square foot unit? That makes no sense, you know, especially if it's sitting on a corridor, a transportation corridor. I understand that parking reductions are liberally given, and that's good. But why even have that? That doesn't make any sense anymore. You know, the smaller the unit should be more parking. I guess sat in these neighborhood meetings, and sometimes it's, oh, well, it's a 400 square foot unit, but really there's going to be 2 people living there and they're both going to have cars. That's the argument, right? And I've heard that argument for decades. And then they get built and it's not a problem. People aren't parking in the neighborhoods because they don't have 2 cars. You know what I mean? So anyway, but that's the kind of stuff that should get cleaned up. And then I think your suggestions are great.
Can I ask a follow-up on Terry's point? How did you get from 1.25 to 1.0 in that recommendation? What was the thinking there?
Well, just that the code already for like efficiency living units is 1 per unit. So it just didn't make sense to have 1.25. So just make it 1 per unit.
Okay, so it's not like, it's just, it's just sort of like you eyeballed it, you said, this makes more sense. It's not like there was some analysis that like you did the regressions and it came out to 1.0 is the better answer.
Yeah, and it's been kind of a part of the code that we've been looking at for quite a while as being antiquated and as an opportunity for cleanup.
And how do you have 1.25 cars for each?
Well, yeah, I mean, yeah. It actually sounds.
Say this, we'll have one thing on parking, right? And this is something we run into all the time in the real world. You have the city who says, oh, we want less parking, less parking, less parking, right? And we'll grant you these parking reductions, and actually we don't want a lot of parking. Then you have the market, right? You have the people that actually rent or buy your units saying, well, I really want a place to park my car. So you have to balance that. And it's very hard to do. Because you have the marketplace, the consumer saying, no, I want parking or one space or whatever it is. And then you have the city and the zoning saying, we don't want parking. So you have to weigh those things. It's tough.
Well, so my view on that one is the first step is you unbundle parking from the unit. Whether it's a rental or an ownership unit, you unbundle it. That way, the unit that has two young people that want two cars, they pay for two parking spaces.
Unbundle, what is that?
Unbundle means that when I lease if I lease a unit to Philip and he comes without a car, he's renting an apartment. He's not renting a parking space, right? So you unbundle it. And so that same, if you have 44 units, you have 44 parking spaces, and not everybody wants a space, but the people that want to, they bear the true cost of coming with two cars versus Philip comes with a bike and he's subsidizing by not using his space.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, so he's subsidized. But the second thing that's really critical, we ran into it in the 44 micro units. They wanted a really big parking reduction, and the neighborhood, it's like, oh, this is gonna be awful because you're talking about having 26 parking spaces for 44 units.
Yep.
Well, that's fine if they're unbundled. But the problem is we're telling the developer, you got to charge for those parking spaces. You got to unbundle them. And then in the same breath, the city has a whole bunch of free parking in the city right of way next door. So the neighbors are like, well, where are they going to park? They're going to park on the street because it's free, even though we're telling the developer to charge a market rate for a parking space. And so the city, we really are a little bit schizophrenic on how we deal with parking in the right of way versus what we're telling developers, our vision for a car-like future.
I totally agree. And unbundling works very well in those where you have a common parking lot, right? Where you have 40 units or 20 units up above or whatever the case may be in a parking lot that's affiliated with it. You get a different discussion when it's more single family or duplex, and everybody wants to park and walk into their unit. That's a different thing, but I totally agree. And that goes exactly with what I was saying. You get the neighbors saying one thing, you get the market saying one thing, you get the city saying another thing, and you're in the middle trying to balance all this stuff.
So I have a suggestion, since the conversation has gone to parking. Well, that's an important issue.
That's huge.
And we've had some really helpful guest presentations from on various issues like single family housing. And I would love to zoom in a creative parking person to talk about things like unbundling, which is also can factor in like shared parking between commercial and residential uses.
Overlap.
It's all about efficiency and keeping
Yeah,
the
joint session.
down and making it as efficient as possible. But it'd be great to get somebody like we had in December come in and say, this is how they do it in Portland and Denver and maybe a college town like Boulder, just to see what some of the creative ideas out there are and how they might be working. So if you folks are up for that, I'd be happy to help round someone up. Or give suggestions.
Maybe a joint session with Tad, perhaps.
Could be a joint session with Tad about it.
And then it's like, who's the advisory board for the Department of Community Vitality, which actually controls parking in the paid parking sense? No, it was a rhetorical dig. It's one of my longtime problems is that is that we have a transportation advisor board, a transportation department, a planning department. And we have the Department of Community Vitality that controls parking.
You think overall we've done a pretty good job managing parking though? I mean, if you look at all of our sub-communities, you look at all the areas. I mean, there's a few spots where it's bad, but I don't know, it's not that bad.
It's woefully underpriced.
Oh,
The neighborhood parking. $120 a year.
oh, yeah.
You know, for a Mapleton Hill resident to have a, and they get the benefit of living close to downtown, but they have a guaranteed parking spot in front of their house for $120 a year.
Oh, yeah.
Of 200 square feet of the most valuable, you know, some of those valuable real estate on earth.
You take Prospero and the Hill out.
Grossly underpriced.
The rest of the cities doesn't really have a parking problem. I mean.
Well, but when I say parking problem, we're not achieving our goals because we are underpricing parking. And same thing with downtown merchants. We should, anyway, I know it's private property, but anyway, the Department of Community Vitality is undervalues parking.
So could be true. How does everyone feel about having a dedicated time, talk about parking with a guest expert in one of our future meetings?
Good idea.
I'm keeping an eye on the time. I have to go back to the cryogenic storage shortly after 9 o'clock, so we'll try to wrap up.
Yes.
So Carl, do you need us to vote on anything or just?
Nope, all this feedback is really helpful.
Well, I think,
We'll love to hear what it sounds like.
you know, this is a big part of our work plan is looking at this single family zoning issue. We're going to keep working it. And I think we
Have to.
now have a timeline, you know, digesting thoughts and coming up with some ideas for recommendation to go to planning board in July. So, you know, this will continue to be a major agenda item for us. And thank you for all that.
I'm sorry, is it planning board in July or is that right?
I think it's August.
Okay, so I'm saying we'd have to get a recommendation to you, planning board.
Right, early, right.
Have a
Okay.
new chair, by the way.
Huh?
Does planning board have a new chair?
That will be determined on April. Yes, there will be a new chair and that will be April 4th meeting.
Gotcha. Thank you.
So I would just ask if you guys have any feedback for Carl, like how in terms of the presentation, because he's gonna have to give this tomorrow. If there's anything that was helpful or a little bit confusing or.
Well, it was all helpful and it was the opposite of confusing, a lot of good clarification there. And I think as a board, we would like, you know, to work towards strong recommendations on the single family zoning part of it. Is that a good summary of our comments, folks?
Yeah, I found it very helpful and you know, for me, revisiting intensity versus density, that was really helpful. You know, I think helping people just remember how to calculate an FAR and what that actually means is really helpful. So, you know, anyway, I think those basics and making sure you've got people coming along with those basics, super helpful. Certainly is for me.
You asking Jay if we should make specific comments about the presentation
Giving it tomorrow night.
to be improved. Right,
Yes.
I think it's a fine presentation.
Thank you.
The Diagonal Plaza buffet of zoning is great.
Yeah.
You know, because you take something that's real and you can see it and you say, well, if we stuck with just this zoning, then we'd only have that. If we stuck with just this zoning, we'd only have the other. But by picking and choosing, and I like to pick and choose, we got such a better project. That's very helpful because it's practical, it's now, it's real, and you can see it in 4 different examples.
That's good feedback. I was really nervous about that slide.
Okay, I think we can move on to our next agenda item if anyone is good with that, and that would be matters from the staff.
And so I have one main thing that I wanted to share with this group. So the city is offering racial equity training. So to all the boards and commissions. Did you guys hear about this already?
We have not.
So you will. So these are some options that staff is throwing out there in terms of how to train. The different boards. So we don't have to decide tonight, but I just wanted to throw this out there, get some initial thoughts. And I'd like to get feedback to them fairly soon. But
My deadline's Friday.
oh, yeah, by Friday. That's right. Thank you, Tiffany. But really, and I don't know, has anyone done any of the racial equity training? Okay, and so a lot of city staff have, it's really helpful. You know, as Philip talked about, you know, we spent a lot of time and effort putting together housing equity symposium. You know, talked about the history of racial equity is really just housing, but this is really thinking about how your decisions are impacted by your worldview or your basically what you learned in history class. So I would strongly encourage it. It's not a requirement. So you can go one route. We could have, they're happy to come to a future HAB meeting. We could all do it together. Or we could make it more voluntary and people could go to trainings as they're offered. So I would say that that's really the two options for you guys.
So the city's offering the three options that you have in front of you. So I just need to give them feedback on what the board is kind of leaning towards. Whether you're thinking you'd like to have one session at a board meeting, if you'd like to individually join. I think the first option is like the last Thursday of every month.
Third Thursday, yeah.
Third Thursday where they offer it already, and you can just join one of the sessions. So I just need to give them some feedback on what the board kind of thinks so that they know what to schedule to make sure that they've got enough people available for scheduling purposes.
Well, I've done racial equity training for this board through my former employer and through another volunteer thing, and it is very worthwhile. I would prefer the volunteer option to people do it on their own rather than voting a meeting. I think it would possibly cut into our very busy work plan. Dedicate an entire meeting to doing it as a group, but I do concur it's extremely valuable.
Yeah, I'd say since we only meet once a month and it's always pretty packed, probably the volunteer option would be better.
That's my preference. Yeah, I'd hate to, I mean, yeah, like you said, we've got a full work plan and I'm happy to spend a Thursday or some other time that's scheduled per option C.
Sure.
Anyone else?
I'm gonna change the vote.
I can just kind of give them.
No, that's fine, yeah, she's good. I'd be happy to go for the meeting, but that's okay.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, and I just wanted to look at our work plan real quick. So Carl, you're gonna come back again next month, talk about occupancy.
You want to talk about that?
Yes.
We'll start planning our retreat in April as well, at our April meeting. Probably schedule that for maybe June. And then we'll talk about listening sessions again. That's what I have on my list. So I did get confirmation from the city clerk's office that basically we get to choose returning in person or not with the public. So you could do it for specific meetings, you could do it for all meetings. It's really at the discretion of each board and commission.
We are limited to this space, however, so we won't be going back to council chambers, so just keep that in mind for spatial consideration.
Practically, we really couldn't have more than about 5.
Yeah, especially for the duration of the meeting if they stay.
Well, so keep in mind too, the listening session, we could arrange for a special space,
Right.
but our our regular meetings, yes, we would have
I
to.
don't think 5 or 6 is a problem, because how many do we get? 2 or 3 generally.
But do you think the engagement's gonna increase if we go back to in person? Or would that not change?
I'm sorry, saying.
Do you think the engagement with the public would change
Oh, it might,
or increase if we invite them back in person?
might, especially if they got the beat that I got.
True.
We don't feed them, we don't feed the.
Don't tell them about that.
But well, the history is any guide.
Do you vote on right away or think about it for the next?
No, it's just something for you to think about.
I'd say everyone just think about it. That's one thing.
But if anything, history is a guide. I mean, pre-pandemic, we didn't have a lot of people testifying
Okay.
or public participation. I think it was pretty consistent. We actually probably had more during the pandemic. To be perfectly honest, because I think it's more convenient.
In my experience, that both on tab and planning board, you know, not having to, being able to cook dinner, put the kids to bed, and then when your topic that you're interested in as a citizen comes up, you haven't been sitting in council chambers. You know, I have found it both as a citizen and as a board member to be far greater ability to participate in these meetings. And so
Maybe
I'm certainly,
hybrid where we have resident guests in the room and others could zoom in.
Yeah, sorry, I should have been more clear. So the hybrid is here to stay. So that's not an option to get rid of it because I think the city has found that it has been effective.
Right, that's great. No reason.
Yeah, I'm there.
not to do it. Any other matters from staff?
No, but if there's other agenda items, just let me know. Are there?
Yeah, I would love to have the update on the airport discussion included in the agenda. Of course, we want to keep on talking about zoning for affordable housing. Maybe go back to some of the memo and some of the material I sent out last month and have more discussion around that.
So I would recommend that we get together with Philip and figure out which meetings make the most sense. Unless you want to just do it at every single meeting between now and the end. You may want to think because, and just to be clear, I mean. Everyone's expectations you are representing have, not yourself. So we just need to be super clear about it. So when you provide feedback. Making sure that you're checking in with the group.
Great. Anyone else have agenda items to suggest? There's still time after this meeting, but anything top of mind? Okay,
If anything comes up, let me know. You guys know how to reach me.
quick meeting debrief. We had some public comment tonight. We approved our minutes. We passed a recommendation on the ADU code update. Supporting the council's, supporting the planning board, the council's direction on this. We had a great discussion with tremendous input from Carl. And something for affordable housing and just decided we would keep that pretty high on our agenda and our work plan. We talked about racial equity, training opportunities and future meetings with public members present in person. And when is our next meeting?
April 26th. April 26th.
Okay. Any other comments or do I have a motion to adjourn?
I'll moved.
All in favor? Thank you.
Good work, Karen. That's what's like the long one. This is longer than you guys.
Yeah.
Carl, you familiar with the Mapleton 30th Scott Hopkins Element affordable deal next to Hyundai over there?
Yeah.